He never cried. Not when the buildings fell. Not when his brother stopped moving. Not even when his mother forgot his name. They say the war never reached his planet. But that wasn't true. It didn't arrive with fleets or generals. It came in the form of silence, the kind of silence that smothered screams before they began. Gravus was born on a mid-rim mining world, once rich in ore, now stripped bare by the Republic's war machine. By the time he was 6, the factories had closed, the mines had collapsed, and the governors had fled. What remained were shadows and children too quiet for their age. He lived in a tenement tower near the edge of the canyon. They had no heat, no medicine, no food, just each other. But one by one, each other began to disappear. Some were taken by raiders, others by disease, the rest by starvation. And yet, the boy survived. He didn't beg, he didn't scream. He just sat in the corner of a blackened stairwell and listened. For hours, for days. To others, it was the creak of metal or the wind through broken glass. But for him, it was voices. They didn't speak in words. They hummed, echoed, remembered. They told him things he didn't understand about fire, about hunger, about betrayal. Sometimes he heard laughter in the walls. Sometimes he thought it was his father's voice. But his father had never come home from the foundry. And still, he never cried. The galaxy was busy with greater things. The Jedi were leading legions. The Sith were tearing open hyperspace. The Mandalorians were carving new frontiers. No one had time for a child born in the ruins. Especially not one who refused to speak. They called him mute, but he wasn't. He simply didn't see the point. The adults lied. The soldiers stole. The other children didn't listen. But the voices in the walls did. One day, the tower collapsed. Some said it was sabotage. Others said it was mercy. Gravus was in the basement when it happened, hiding near a broken water main. When they pulled him from the rubble 3 days later, he had a cracked rib, a deep cut over his eye, and dried blood around his ears. But he still didn't cry. The relief team that found him thought he was in shock. They gave him a blanket, a ration bar, a name tag. But he dropped the tag. It wasn't his name. Not anymore. Because the day the tower fell, he heard a new voice, clearer than the others, sharper, closer. It didn't call him by name. It didn't promise comfort. It only asked a question. Why are you still here? He didn't know how to answer. Years later, he would remember that voice not as a hallucination, but as a beginning, a presence, a shadow pressing against the edge of his thoughts. It didn't offer him power. It didn't tempt him with freedom. It just reminded him of something he already believed. That silence was safer than truth. That survival was quieter than hope. That the galaxy had already decided what he was worth. And so, he waited. He waited as the towers burned. He waited as the workers disappeared. He waited as the stars grew colder above him. He was just a boy. But in that forgotten world, in that forgotten corner of the Republic, a boy who never cried had already begun to listen. He didn't remember the explosion, only the warmth. When the ceiling caved in, it wasn't fire that reached him first. It was light, a strange, quiet glow that seemed to move without flicker. Dust settled like snow. His heartbeat was the only sound. And then, the silence broke. Not with screaming, not with falling debris, but with breathing. He wasn't alone. They found him buried beneath concrete and rusted wiring, clinging to a bent piece of rebar like it was a lifeline. He was unconscious, but his eyes were open. And even then, even beneath the blood, the dirt, the silence, he was listening. What he heard would never be explained. Some said he suffered neurological trauma, that the collapse had damaged his hearing. Others believed he was simply broken, a victim of shock, of famine, of war. But the truth was stranger. He heard things that weren't there. Not hallucinations, not voices, but impressions, echoes, shadows with memory. They didn't speak in language. They pulsed. They bled. They whispered pain through sensation alone. He never told the medics. He didn't need to. They saw it in his eyes. Every time he passed a ruin, he would stop. Every time he stood near a grave, he would fall silent. Every time someone died nearby, he would turn and stare, like the air had changed. He wasn't force-sensitive in the way the Jedi measured. Not yet. But something was happening inside him. Something the Force couldn't hide anymore. Gravus, still just a boy, began to wander through the ruins at night. Barefoot, silent, never leaving footprints. He walked through burned libraries, stepping over bones. He visited collapsed temples and forgotten bunkers. Sometimes he sat near mass graves until the sun rose. And each time, the whispers grew clearer. They taught him nothing directly, no names, no instructions, no promises, only feelings. He would wake from sleep with tears in his eyes, not his own. He would shiver in the heat, chilled by memories not his. One night, he screamed not from fear, but from grief so ancient he didn't know where it ended. It didn't make him afraid. It made him calm, because for the first time in his life, something was listening back. The adults began to fear him, not openly, not violently, just quietly. They started locking their doors, moving away when he came near. Whispers followed him now, not from the dead, but from the living. He doesn't sleep. He talks to the walls. I saw him smile when the storm hit. He didn't smile, not truly, but there were moments where something cold touched his lips. Moments when he felt seen not by people, but by things long buried. And still, the Jedi did not come. The Republic sent a surveyor to assess the planet's recovery. She wore robes like a diplomat and asked careful questions. She met Gravus once. He was 9, quiet, thin. His eyes were too still. She performed a scan. Midichlorian levels were noted, but not exceptional. Emotional profile flagged attachment, likely trauma. She left the next morning. Gravus never looked up during her visit. But the moment her ship rose into orbit, he turned to the crater behind the hospital and whispered something. No one was near enough to hear it. No one but the grave. Later, when asked about that time, survivors recalled a boy who aged without growing. A boy who didn't play, didn't cry, didn't run. A boy who sat with the dead as if they were the only ones who could hear him. And maybe they were. The last food convoy arrived on his 12th birthday. He didn't know it was his birthday. No one did. No one cared. Time had blurred into a quiet loop: sunrise, silence, scavenging, sleep. And the convoy didn't bring celebration. It brought measurement. The Republic wasn't here to save them, just to count them. Medical teams conducted evaluations. Tall men with datapads asked how long since last nourishment. Women in white recorded pulse rates, bone density, retinal response. No one smiled. He watched them like animals in a cage, controlled, predictable, fragile. They examined him last. His vitals were stable. No infections, malnourished but functional. He met every question with a blank stare, offering no defiance, no fear, and no answers. When they placed the neuroprobe to his temple, it shorted out. Twice. He didn't move when it happened. Just blinked once, slowly. That was when the Jedi came. Not a master, not even a knight. Just an observer. assigned by the Council to assess force sensitivity in war-impacted sectors. She wore no armor. Her saber remained hidden. She was young, barely more than a Padawan herself. But her eyes were kind. That was the first thing he noticed, how kind they looked before they turned away. She tested 32 children. 2 were selected for transport to a Jedi enclave on Dantooine. Gravus was not one of them. When she approached him, he stood without being asked. He didn't resist the scans. He didn't react when she pressed her hand to his chest, seeking echoes of the Force. But she paused. For just a second, she frowned. "His presence feels wrong," she whispered. The medical droid nodded. "Unstable, possibly dissociative. He hears things," another nurse added. "Claims the shadows speak." The Jedi turned back to him. He was staring through her, not at her face, but at something behind her. Something only he could see. He didn't blink. "His connection is fractured," she finally said. "No clarity, no emotion. It's silent." And so, she marked his record, not viable for Jedi training, subject psychologically damaged. She never saw him again. He watched her ship ascend into the clouds, carrying the lucky ones, the chosen, the ones with hope. But hope had always been for someone else. In that moment, something broke, not with sound, not with anger, but with understanding. They would never come back. The Jedi had seen his silence and mistaken it for emptiness. They couldn't feel the voices. They didn't hear the ghosts. He wasn't weak. He was full, overflowing with things they feared to name. And so, they left him behind. Just like the Republic, just like the miners, just like the workers, the healers, the soldiers, they all came, measured, judged, and left. And he remained. He wandered the ruins that night in bare feet, letting the glass cut his skin. He climbed the collapsed library and stood beneath the stars. He whispered to the dead and waited for them to whisper back. They always did. But this time, a new voice answered. Not a whisper, not a feeling. A voice, old, heavy, patient. It didn't promise him anything. It didn't offer salvation. It simply said, "I see you." He didn't speak aloud. He didn't question it. He just nodded. And something nodded back. He would not be left behind again. They didn't arrive in ships. There was no fanfare, no thunder in the sky. Just a quiet transport docking on the far side of the settlement, long after the Republic had withdrawn. 3 figures stepped into the dust. They wore no insignia, no armor, no colors of allegiance. But the silence moved with them, like gravity. Children stopped playing. Traders closed their stalls. A whisper moved through the camp like smoke. Sith. The boy had never heard the word spoken aloud. He had read it once, carved into the walls of a broken government hall. A warning, a curse. But when he looked at the men in the dust, he felt nothing like fear. He felt recognition. Like the shadows had finally stepped forward. They didn't ask for names. They didn't give any. They examined the population one by one, looking for something they didn't define. They weren't searching for kindness, or strength, or intelligence. They were looking for silence. The kind that didn't mean absence but control. When they found the boy, he was sitting alone on the edge of the canyon, staring into the lightless expanse. He didn't move when they approached. The leader crouched beside him, his face masked, his presence deliberate. Not forceful, not cruel, just precise. He didn't ask how the boy had survived. He didn't ask where his family was. He didn't ask if he wanted to leave. He asked one question. What do you hear when you close your eyes? The boy answered, not in words, but in stillness. And the Sith understood. He rose to his feet and turned to the others. "This one," he said, "he already listens." There was no ceremony, no celebration, no farewell. The boy walked into the ship without hesitation. No one stopped him. No one noticed he was gone. No one ever remembered his name. But inside the ship, in the cold hum of the engines, the masked man asked again, "Do you remember who you are?" The boy didn't answer, not because he was unsure, but because he no longer cared. Names belonged to the ones who were left behind. He had been chosen not for what he said, but for what he heard. And in the Sith, silence was not a weakness. It was a weapon. As the transport left orbit, the boy looked back at the world that shaped him. The broken towers, the ash-filled skies, the ghosts. And for the first time, he spoke aloud. They never came. The Sith at his side nodded once. They never do. No one on the ship knew his name. Not the one he was born with. Not the one he had abandoned. But as the stars stretched into lines and the past was buried behind light, the shadows whispered something new. A title not yet earned. A future not yet forged. But it was coming. In the years ahead, he would walk the halls of Coraban. He would bleed in silence. He would listen to tombs that hadn't spoken in centuries. And in time, he would become something worse than feared. He would become understood. But that night, as the galaxy fell quiet once more, the shadows gave him something no one else had ever given. A place. And soon, a name. The descent into Coraban did not begin with fear. It began with silence. No ceremony marked their arrival. No words were spoken by the instructors waiting beyond the landing pad. The boy walked with the others initiates, scavenged from broken worlds toward the black steps of the ancient academy. Even among the Sith, few places were older. The wind howled across the red sand like a dying voice. Pillars leaned into the sky like bones of forgotten titans. And above them, carved into the cliff face, stood the academy, not a building, but a scar. A wound in stone that refused to close. Gravus didn't look up. He didn't ask where they were. He didn't need to. He had heard about Coraban long before he saw it. The tomb world, the cradle of darkness, the graveyard that whispered back. And now he was home. The first lesson was simple. Survive. There were no classes, no rooms with beds, only corridors and pain. The acolytes were given robes, dull blades, and a promise: only the strong would leave this place alive. Most mistook strong to mean brutal. Gravus did not. He watched as the others bled for the approval of their overseers. They fought each other in pits, in halls, even in their sleep. Whispers of poisonings, secret duels, and sabotage spread faster than fire. He didn't participate. Not because he was afraid, but because he saw what they didn't. None of them were being trained. They were being watched. Every broken nose, every flinch, every scream was recorded. The instructors walked among them like vultures, waiting to see who would die cleanly and who would decay. Gravus didn't give them anything. He slept near the walls, away from the heat of the others. He spoke only when forced. And when fights came, and they always came, he moved with an eerie calm. No anger, no sound, no wasted movement. He didn't win through power. He survived through disappearance. Soon, the others stopped trying to provoke him. He wasn't fun to fight. He didn't react. He didn't cry out. It was like striking water, cold, yielding, and impossible to break. The instructors noticed. One day, Overseer Malvek approached him in the courtyard. The man was known for his brutality, his hands stained from years of discipline. He towered over the boy, sneering. "You think silence makes you strong," he said. Gravus didn't respond. Malvek struck him across the face with the back of his gauntlet. The sound echoed, the others froze. Gravus didn't move. He didn't raise his eyes, he didn't reach for his weapon. He just bled slow, precise, like it had been allowed. Malvek narrowed his eyes. "Even stone cracks," he muttered, and walked away. That night, Gravus didn't tend to the wound. He let it dry. Because pain was not something to escape, it was something to observe. And here, in the black holes of Coraban, pain was the only language everyone understood. But Gravus spoke another one. He began to wander not during the day, when the overseers watched, but at night, when the screams faded and the halls went quiet. He wasn't looking for escape, he was listening. And the tombs were waiting. Coraban did not kill quickly. It peeled away layers. First comfort, then pride, then the illusion that anyone cared whether you lived or died. The academy thrived on that slow erosion. It wanted to see what remained when everything else had been carved away. Some acolytes shattered early, others hardened into cruelty. Gravus became something different. He moved through the days like a shadow passing through fire. Initiates clawed for ranking. They sharpened blades in the dark, stole rations, poisoned water skins, bribed overseers with secrets they barely understood. Yet none of it touched him. He didn't compete. He didn't scheme. He didn't break. He simply watched. And that made him dangerous. The Sith did not fear rage. They feared emptiness, the kind that did not crack under pressure. Because there was nothing left to crush. Gravus was becoming that emptiness. And even those who bullied weaker acolytes sensed it. So, they tried to force him to feel. It began in the training yard. The sun was low, turning the sand blood red. Overseer Malvek gathered the initiates around the dueling circle. Gravus stood at the edge, silent, waiting. "Two will fight," Malvek growled. "One will walk away." He pointed to Gravus first. Then to a larger acolyte, Kelnar, known for breaking bones just to hear the sound. He stepped into the ring with a grin, rotating his shoulders as if preparing for a game. Gravus entered without expression. Malvek tossed them practice blades, dull but heavy, enough to maim, enough to kill if aimed well. "Begin." Kelnar charged immediately, swinging with brute strength. The blade cut the air with a whistle. Gravus stepped aside, letting the strike pass like wind. He didn't counter, didn't advance. He simply moved again when the second blow came. This angered Kelnar. "You're mocking me," he spat, swinging harder. Gravus didn't blink. The fight became a storm of pointless fury on one side, and silence on the other. Each miss fed Kelnar's frustration. Each calm step drained his confidence. And the others noticed. Malvek stepped forward. "He refuses to engage," he said. "Make him bleed." Kelnar roared and rushed him again. This time, Gravus didn't move fast enough. The blade struck his ribs, splitting skin and forcing him to the ground. He didn't cry out. He didn't even breathe differently. Kelnar hesitated, just for a heartbeat. Something in Gravus's stillness unsettled him, as if the wound didn't matter. As if pain meant nothing to the boy kneeling in the sand. Malvek snarled, "Finish it." Kelnar raised his blade for a killing strike. Gravus finally lifted his eyes. There was no fear, no anger, no desperation. Only clarity. When Kelnar brought the blade down, Gravus rolled beneath it, snatched a handful of sand, and drove it into the acolyte's eyes. The larger boy stumbled back, blinded, screaming. Gravus rose, moving with a quiet precision that felt unnatural in someone so young. He struck once, not with cruelty, but necessity, a clean blow across Kelnar's throat, not deep enough to kill, but deep enough to silence. Kelnar collapsed. The yard went still. Gravus stepped away, blood dripping down his side, his breathing unchanged. Malvek watched him with a strange expression. Not approval, not pride. Recognition. That, he said quietly, is the strength of the Sith. But Gravus knew better. This was not strength. It was survival, shaped into silence. That night, as he cleaned the dried blood from his robes, he listened to the academy settle into darkness. The cries of the day faded. The torches hissed in the halls, and beneath it all, the faintest whisper, not praise, not warning, just presence. He didn't know it yet, but Coraban was beginning to notice him, and the dead were starting to speak louder. There were places in the academy where no lessons were taught, no duels staged, no overseers patrolled, just corridors that turned too sharply, rooms with doors too heavy for their age, stairs that led downward, but were never on the schematics. Gravus went there, often, not as a rebel, not out of defiance, but because the surface had nothing more to offer. He had watched the fights. He had studied the lectures. He had mastered every lesson in survival they fed him. But the real knowledge was buried, deep beneath the stone. It started with dreams, fragments of places he'd never seen. A throne room swallowed in vines, a tomb sealed with obsidian hands, a great beast sleeping in sand that bled light. Each morning, he would wake with dried blood beneath his nose and voices echoing through his chest. He knew what they wanted, not to harm him, not to save him, to be heard. The old catacombs ran beneath the academy like veins. Most of them led to shrines, dusty tributes to Sith Lords long dead. Ajunta Pol, Tulak Horde, Marka Ragnos, monuments to legacy, warnings of failure. But one corridor led deeper. No torches lined the walls there. No carvings spoke names. Only a long path of stone, untouched by footsteps. Gravus followed it anyway. The others wouldn't have dared. But he wasn't searching for power. He was listening for something that didn't want to be found. And down there, past the false doors and broken symbols, he found it. A chamber not built but carved. The walls were smooth, almost soft. There were no lights, no sounds, no air. But there was a presence. It waited for him, like a breath held too long. He stepped inside, and the voices fell silent. Then, one of them spoke, not in basic, not in any language known to the galaxy. But he understood it completely. It didn't ask his name. It already knew. It didn't demand obedience. It didn't offer reward. It only asked a question. Will you carry what others buried? He didn't speak aloud, but the answer filled the room. Yes. A pulse echoed through the stone, deep and slow like a heart buried in bedrock. Symbols began to glow along the floor. Not bright, just enough to cast shadows. A name moved through his mind, not his own, not yet, but close. Gravus would not remember how long he stayed. It could have been minutes, could have been hours. The air never changed. Time didn't matter here. He left the chamber without taking anything. But something left with him. The next day, his overseer called his name during blade drills. Gravus didn't move. His thoughts were elsewhere, too far to return quickly. When the instructor shouted again, Gravus finally turned, not in defiance, but confusion. Like he'd forgotten the name belonged to him. That was when the others started watching him differently. He hadn't won more duels. He hadn't taken a higher rank. But there was something behind his eyes now, something that looked back at them. Not arrogance, not ambition, just depth. The kind you couldn't measure. The kind you didn't survive by accident. He no longer walked the halls like a student. He moved like a whisper passed between walls. He stopped eating with the others. He answered only when necessary. But when he did, people listened. Even the instructors lowered their voices near him. Because in the quiet spaces between lessons and violence, something in the stone had shifted. Gravus hadn't claimed anything. But Coraban had begun to give. They never said his name in public. But they spoke it in whispers, in corners, in rooms where torches burned low, and no overseer listened. Not Gravus. That wasn't his yet. They called him the Hollow One. It wasn't meant as praise. He didn't laugh like the others. Didn't rage, didn't threaten, didn't cry out when wounded. It was as if something inside him had been removed or worse, replaced. By then, weeks had passed since his descent into the forgotten chamber. He never returned to it. He didn't need to, because it had followed him. When he slept, he dreamed in languages not spoken for centuries. When he fought, he saw things before they happened, not visions, not precognition, just a subtle knowledge of what someone would choose to do, as if they had already done it once before. Some acolytes tried to befriend him. Others tried to goad him into violence. One even offered an alliance, a pact to rise together through the ranks. Gravus said nothing. The acolyte disappeared 2 days later. No one ever found a body. No one asked questions. The overseers stopped assigning him duels, not because he was unbeatable but because he made them uncomfortable. Even the sadistic ones, the instructors who delighted in breaking bones, began giving him space. And still, he said nothing. The only one who showed interest was the archivist. Old, blind, and ignored by most, she kept to a corner chamber near the base of the western wing. There were no holocrons in her care. Only scrolls, faded stone fragments, things most had forgotten how to read. Gravus visited her often. He didn't ask questions, he just listened. And one day, she spoke to him, her voice dry as dust. "There is no power in knowledge," she said. "Only weight, most crumble under it." He didn't reply. She nodded, as if that was the correct answer. "You've heard them, haven't you?" He didn't flinch. Down in the stone, in the cracks, in the dark where the others won't go. For the first time, Gravus met her eyes. She smiled faintly. "They speak to you because you don't speak back. They know you're not trying to own them, just understand." That was the closest thing to approval he ever received. And it didn't make him feel proud. It made him feel real. The academy continued around him. Acolytes rose. Others died. The cycle sharpened itself as the months passed. Overseers were replaced. Factions rose and fell. Gravus remained, not as a leader, not as a favorite, just as a presence. Even the instructors spoke his name differently now. Not with command, with caution. One called him the Quiet Wound. Another said, "He's not learning the Sith way, he's remembering it." But the title that stayed was the one the other acolytes used when no one else could hear. The Hollow One. Because when he stood in a room, the air changed. When he passed through a hall, the torches flickered. And when he fought, it was like watching a reflection not of who he was, but of what others feared they might become. Empty, still, unbreakable. Not because he had mastered the darkness, but because he had accepted it completely. By the end of his first year, the academy marked his progress as irregular. No formal promotions, no accolades, no sponsorship, but none dared remove him. Because whatever Gravus was becoming, he had already become too quiet to stop. She didn't speak when she entered. Darth Solins was not a figure of myth. She was smaller than the stories claimed. Her voice was soft. Her robes were simple. And yet, when she stepped into the archive hall that day, even the air seemed to retreat. She passed by rows of initiates without looking at them. Until she saw Gravus. He didn't bow, didn't speak, just stood there, hands clasped behind his back, eyes lowered in the way Coraban taught. She studied him for a long time, then turned to the archivist beside her. "This one," she said. That was all. The next morning, Gravus was removed from the dormitories. No explanation was given, no ritual, no ceremony. He didn't pack. He didn't return. The others didn't ask. Everyone knew what it meant to be chosen by a Darth. Most never came back. Her fortress was buried in the cliffs beyond the academy. No maps marked it. No instructors dared approach. It wasn't built, it was carved, grown, shaped by energies the newer Sith no longer understood. Inside, the walls pulsed with something old. The stones bled faint red veins. The air was heavy with incense that didn't burn. Solins didn't greet him. She didn't offer rules. She didn't offer praise. She simply left him there in the atrium beneath the roots of the rock and vanished into the dark. Gravus waited. For hours, then days. He was given no bed, no food, just space, dust, silence. And still, he said nothing. She watched from the upper chambers, through channels of smoke, through mirrors that reflected only what the soul tried to hide. Most initiates would have broken. Gravus didn't. He ate nothing for 3 days, slept leaning against cold stone. When she finally descended, he was standing, exactly where she left him. She stepped into the chamber and walked a slow circle around him. "You didn't try to leave," she said. He said nothing. "You didn't ask why." Still silence. Finally, she stopped behind him. "There is no reward for obedience." He turned slightly. "There is no need for reward," he said. She almost smiled. And then, without warning, she raised her hand and struck him across the back of the head with a blackwood staff. He fell hard. Blood touched the floor. He didn't move. She leaned down beside him and whispered, "Good." That was the beginning. She wasn't a teacher. She was a test. Every hour, every breath. She would vanish for days, then return with a single question, posed without context. What color does pain remember? What happens to a memory when no one survives it? If he answered too quickly, she struck him. If he hesitated, she waited longer. If he lied, she left him alone sometimes for a week. She didn't want obedience. She wanted reflection. Because what she saw in him wasn't a student. It was a puzzle, a mirror that didn't distort, only revealed. She had chosen him, not because she trusted him, but because she wanted to know what he would become. The Sith taught that power must be seized, that fear must be wielded. But Solins believed in something older, something buried in blood and whisper. She believed power could be transferred not through blade or bond, but through recognition. And in Gravus, she saw something she had not seen in a century, a future she could not predict, that terrified her. So she brought him close, and taught him how to disappear. Darth Solins never taught directly. She did not lecture. She did not spar. Her teachings came in fragments, gestures, artifacts, riddles etched into bone. She spoke a language that most apprentices never heard, one made not of words, but of absence. Her rituals were slow, ancient. Some believed them forgotten. others believed them forbidden. She called it the first tongue, the voice of the Force before speech was shaped. It had no vowels, no syntax, just sound and reaction. And Gravus listened. He learned how to heat a room without flame, how to thicken air so an enemy could not breathe, how to whisper a thought into another's dream and leave it there, like a splinter in the mind. She never asked him if he understood. He never told her when he did. That was how their lessons worked. He sat in circles made from salt imported from Zyast. She burned oils harvested from worlds whose names had been erased from galactic maps. She smeared ink across his arms that itched without pain, sigils that disappeared when he blinked. Once, she handed him a needle made of crystallized shadow. He was to drive it into his palm, and not close his hand until the sunset came. He didn't flinch. He didn't scream. He just sat there, blood dripping down his wrist, eyes open, watching the horizon fade. When the sun finally fell, she took the needle away. "You waited," she said. "I listened," he replied. That answer unsettled her more than she let him see. Because by then, Gravus was learning faster than she had planned. There was a rhythm in her madness, a pattern beneath the chaos, and he didn't fear it. He didn't fight it. He absorbed it. Every test, every poison, every hallucination forced into his blood, he remembered them all. And not just how to survive them, but how to create them. He began mimicking her techniques in secret, not to rebel, not to impress, just to understand. He reanimated broken insects with heat drawn from his breath. He wrote on walls using ash that couldn't be washed away. One night, he traced a symbol into the stone of the lower chamber, and it refused to fade. When Solins saw it the next morning, she stopped mid-step. "You found it," he said. "Nothing. That mark is older than the Sith," she whispered. He nodded. She didn't punish him, but she didn't praise him either. Instead, she locked the chamber behind him and forbade him from returning. That was how she showed fear, not through anger, but containment. Because knowledge was no longer being passed. It was being taken. In the weeks that followed, her voice grew sharper, her instructions colder. She stopped showing him her hands when she worked. Her staff was always within reach. And still, Gravus remained silent. He obeyed, but not out of loyalty. He stayed, but not out of fear. He was studying her, just as she had once studied him. Their bond was no longer master and apprentice. It had become a dance of mirrored tension, a slow tightening of strings that neither dared cut first. Solins knew he was learning too fast, too well, and Gravus had begun to understand a truth that few apprentices ever saw clearly. The teachings would not end in a lesson. They would end in a decision, and someone would not walk away. The first time she tried to kill him, it wasn't obvious. She called it a meditation trial, a test of endurance in the vacuum chamber, 10 minutes with no sound, no light, and no oxygen support. Others had survived it before, but she sealed the door herself, and doubled the time. Gravus didn't panic. He didn't scratch at the walls. He didn't pound his fists or scream into the dark. He just closed his eyes and listened. At the 11-minute mark, when she opened the chamber, he was still standing, blood dripping from his nose, knees trembling, but alive. Eyes open. He didn't ask her why she waited. She didn't offer a reason. That was how it began. From that day forward, her lessons came with sharper edges. Her instructions grew more cryptic. Tasks were wrapped in misdirection trials with no right answer. Only traps disguised as teachings. One day she asked him to recite the binding oath of Canis Mur. He did. She struck him across the face and said, "That oath was never meant to be spoken aloud. Another day, she gave him a scroll sealed in bone wax. Do not open this until you're ready. When he did, it released a cloud of spores that burned his lungs. She found him coughing on the floor and simply said, "Now you know what unreadiness feels like." Gravus never stopped participating, but he changed how he moved. He no longer responded to her words as commands, only as possibilities. Every lesson became a blade, every compliment a warning, every smile a threat. He had once seen her as a figure of depth. Now he saw her for what she was, a maze, built to test him, built to trap him, built to break him. But Gravus had never needed direction, only clarity, and the deeper he went into her teachings, the more he realized how little she trusted him. Not because he failed her, but because he never needed her approval. One evening, she summoned him to her inner sanctum, a chamber lined with obsidian mirrors. The torches burned blue. Incense coiled through the air like breath from something asleep. But there were no reflections. Every mirror was empty, even when he stood in front of them. He waited. She entered slowly, her hands bare, her staff left behind. Her voice was low when she spoke. "I have shown you every path I know, and you still haven't chosen one." He didn't respond. "You remain unshaped," she said, "and I no longer know if that's by design or defiance." He looked at the mirror beside her, still no reflection, just shadow. "I've chosen a path," he said quietly. She turned. "And what path is that?" He didn't answer with words. He stepped forward, slow and deliberate, until they were just breaths apart. Then he whispered, "The one that doesn't lead back to you." She stared at him for a long time, and then she smiled. It wasn't warmth. It wasn't approval. It was surrender. In that moment, she understood. She had not created him. She had awakened him. And now, every lesson was complete. There would be no graduation, no final duel, no clean severing of ties. Only a slow unraveling until one of them vanished, and the other became what they had feared all along. There is no ceremony for the end of an apprenticeship, no announcement, no title, no applause. Among the Sith, a master is replaced only when the apprentice decides they are ready. But readiness is not measured in strength. It is measured in silence, the moment when fear dissolves, and only inevitability remains. For Gravus, that moment came quietly, not during battle, not during ritual, but on a night when the fortress was colder than usual, and the torches refused to stay lit. Solins summoned him to the upper balcony, a place where she rarely taught. Wind cut through the stone rails. Below them, the cliffs of Coraban swallowed the horizon. She didn't turn to face him. "You've been waiting," she said. He didn't deny it. "I thought I could shape you," she continued. "I thought your silence was an empty vessel, something I could fill." A pause. "But I see it now. You were never empty. You were listening to something else." Gravus stepped closer, though not enough to threaten her. She placed her hand on the rail, fingers trembling just slightly, the first sign of weakness he had ever seen in her. "Tell me," she whispered, "when did you know the moment would come?" He answered honestly, "When you stopped fearing the end." She closed her eyes. "You learned too well." A storm rolled across the valley. Red lightning flashed far away, illuminating the ruins of ancient tombs. The wind picked up, carrying the grit of worlds long dead. Solins reached into her robe and produced a small obsidian shard, flat, etched with symbols Gravus recognized from the catacombs. "This was meant for you," she said. "A anchor, a protection, a way to tether your mind to the present when the deeper voices begin to speak." He didn't take it. She lowered her hand. You don't need it now, do you? No. Her breath shook, not from fear of him, but from what she knew had to happen next. The Sith do not retire. They do not pass on power. They are consumed by it. She turned at last, facing him fully. He saw the acceptance in her eyes, not peace, but clarity. You will surpass me, she said. But power demands a price. You will pay it. All Sith do. He didn't reply. She stepped closer, studying his face as if seeing him for the first time. You remind me of the old ways, she said. The Sith who didn't need anger to be strong. The ones who learned from shadows, not from screams. Her voice softened. I thought I could use you, shape you into a weapon, but you were never meant to be a blade. What was I meant to be? He asked. Her answer came as a whisper carried by the wind. A replacement. Lightning flashed again, and Gravus moved. No flourish, no cruelty, no hesitation. The strike was clean, a single motion, guided not by rage but by inevitability. She fell without sound, collapsing into his arms as if surrendering to gravity. Her final breath touched his shoulder. You listened, she said. That was always your strength. Then she went still. He lowered her body to the stone, not gently, but with respect, the only respect a Sith could offer. Acknowledgement of what she had taught him, and what she had failed to control. The storm deepened. The fortress felt heavier, and Gravus understood what power demanded in return. Not loyalty, not hatred, not triumph, loss. One teacher, one self, one more voice added to the growing quiet inside him. He rose, not as a student, but as something Coraban had not seen in a long, long time. A shadow that did not need to hide. She wasn't supposed to matter. Not to him, not to anyone. She had no title, no lineage, no legacy worth protecting. She was a learner, an acolyte, just another shadow among many on the fringes of Coraban's broken libraries. But she saw him, and worse, she recognized him. Not as Darth Gravus, not even as an apprentice of Solins. She knew him before all of that. Before the fortress, before the title, before the blood. She called him by the name he was born with. Not because she wanted to weaken him, but because she believed it still belonged to him. The first time they spoke, it was in the Eastern Archive, where the walls had collapsed and sand spilled in through the cracks. She was copying an untranslated Sith rune onto parchment. He passed behind her without looking. You're the quiet one, she said, not lifting her eyes. He didn't respond. She dipped her brush again. They call you Gravus, she added. But that's not your name, is it? He stopped walking. She glanced up. Her eyes were not afraid. He stared at her for a long time. How do you know that? He asked. She shrugged. I don't. Not really. But I see how you flinch when others say it, like the word doesn't fit. He said nothing. That should have been the end. But it wasn't. They saw each other again in the Hall of Voices, a chamber where initiates practiced projecting thoughts through silence. She wasn't good at it. He was. He could hear her struggling. Not loudly, just unsteady. After the trial, she approached him. What do you hear? She asked. He looked at her, confused. When you're in the silence, she continued, what do you hear that makes it so easy for you? He didn't know how to answer. No one had ever asked. Eventually, he said, I don't hear anything. But that wasn't true. She didn't press. Instead, she nodded and walked away. That night, he couldn't stop thinking about her. Not because she was beautiful, though she was, in a way too soft for Coraban, but because she believed him. Not the version they whispered about. Not the weapon he had been trained to become, just him. She began to appear more often. In the libraries, in the lower courts, in the abandoned meditation halls that reeked of mold and old blood. She never tried to impress him. She never asked for anything. She just existed near him. And slowly he stopped pushing her away. She called him by his birth name in private. Once, in the lower temple, he asked her not to. She smiled. "You're not afraid of that name," she said. "You're afraid someone will hear it and remember you had a life before this." He didn't reply. Because she was right. He had worked so hard to forget, to bury everything that came before the academy, before Solins, before the Force began whispering through the walls. But now someone had said it aloud, and it stayed in the air. She never asked to be close to him. But she became that anyway. Not a weakness, not a threat, just presence. The one voice that didn't demand obedience. The one touch that didn't take. He never told her what she meant to him. Because in the Sith Order, love was a lie. But when she looked at him, she didn't see a lie. She saw the truth. And that made her dangerous. She knew what he could do. She'd seen it in the dueling rings. In the way others moved out of his path. In the way instructors avoided his gaze, even when giving orders. She knew the stories about the silence he carried, the rituals he survived, the master he'd outlived. And yet, when she looked at him, there was no fear, only knowing. That's what unsettled him most. The Sith thrived on fear, on submission, on trembling respect. But she gave him none of those things. She gave him truth. She once placed her hand on his chest, just over his heart. "There's still something in there," she said. "You've just taught it not to speak." He stepped away, not because he disagreed, but because she had gotten too close to the place where his pain still lived. He didn't know what to call what they had. There was no language for it on Coraban. Affection was weakness. Attachment was punished. Yet every time she sat beside him in the ruins, or passed him a datapad in silence, or watched the sky instead of the tombs, something in him settled. She didn't ask about his past, but she could feel it. She once said, "There are two kinds of Sith, those who run from pain, and those who become it. You remember it. That's different." He didn't answer, because she wasn't wrong. She challenged him in ways he couldn't prepare for. Not with a blade, not with poison, but with presence. She would ask him things no one else dared. "What did you lose before all this?" He didn't reply. "What name do you hear when you dream?" He stared at the wall. "What do you want, really?" That was the one that stayed. Because for the first time in his life, he didn't know. Not power, not rank, not survival. Those were reactions, not desires. But she made him wonder. Sometimes they would sit for hours without speaking, just breathing in the same space. And in those moments, he remembered he was still alive. Not just functioning, alive. The tombs didn't whisper when she was near. The voices fell quiet, as if the darkness itself respected her presence, or resented it. It made her different, and it made her a threat, not to Gravus, but to the Order. Because she didn't want control. She wanted clarity. Once, deep in the archives, she uncovered a scroll written by a forgotten Sith priest. It spoke of a bond that could not be severed. Not love, not loyalty, something older. When two souls recognize each other, she read aloud, they do not fight, they mirror. She looked up at him. I think that's what we are. He left without speaking, but the words didn't leave him. They echoed in his chest like a drumbeat without rhythm. She was not his weakness. She was his witness. To everything he tried to forget. To the part of him still listening. To the part of him that hadn't closed the door. And she was brave enough to stay there. With him. In the dark, she once told him, "You're the most dangerous person I've ever met." He raised an eyebrow. "Because you still feel things," she said, "even if you don't let them surface." And, for a moment, just one, he almost smiled. She never asked him to change, but he changed anyway, because of her. And the galaxy would not forgive that. It didn't happen all at once. There was no betrayal, no warning, no final embrace before the storm. Just a small change, too small to notice, until it had already begun. She had asked questions the others didn't. She had touched things in the tombs no acolyte dared approach. And one day, she spoke an idea aloud that should have stayed buried. "What if the darkness doesn't want obedience?" she said. "What if it just wants to be understood?" It wasn't said in defiance. It wasn't a challenge. It was a whisper, passed between two shadows in a ruined corridor. But someone heard it. A rival, an overseer, or the darkness itself. Gravus never learned who. He only knew that the silence changed afterward. One night, she didn't meet him in the meditation ruins. The next morning, she didn't appear at the arena gates. By midday, the rumors had already started. An acolyte had violated a code. A student had entered a tomb without sanction. A ritual had gone wrong. A heretic had been erased. He searched the halls, the tunnels, the broken chambers, but she was nowhere. He asked no questions. That was the rule. In the Sith Academy, if you asked about someone who vanished, it meant you cared. And if you cared, you bled. But Gravus didn't need to ask. He already knew. She had gone somewhere the Order could not allow. Not physically but spiritually. She had touched something that gave without taking. She had found a place where the dark did not demand suffering in return. And that made her unworthy to remain. He didn't know who gave the order, but he knew who allowed it. Him. He had sensed the change, the cold stares, the quiet distance from the instructors, the shift in air that meant danger was coming. And he had done nothing. Not out of fear, not out of confusion, out of understanding, because in the Sith, mercy was punished, loyalty was leveraged, and love was a death sentence. He told himself she would escape, that she was too clever, that she'd vanish before they reached her. But she hadn't. They never found a body, just blood, scattered relics, and a burned page from the scroll she had shown him, the one about souls that mirror instead of fight. He picked it up from the stone, the edges still warm, the words half erased, and something inside him folded. Not loudly, not with a scream, just folded, like a paper seal, closing over a wound that would never heal. He returned to his chambers, sat on the cold floor for hours, eyes open, hands still, and the voices returned, not gentle this time, not guiding. They howled, they poured into him like smoke through cracks, filling the space she had left behind. He didn't push them away, because they were all he had left. The next day, Gravus returned to his duties. He sparred in silence, ate without pause, answered every command with cold obedience. But something had changed, not in his strength, in his absence. Before, he had listened to the tombs because they were the only ones who heard him. Now, he listened because they were the only ones left. The morning after she was erased, the halls were too quiet. Not empty, just wrong. Acolytes walked with their heads lower. Overseers issued commands more sharply. The air itself had thickened, like smoke that refused to rise. No one mentioned her name. Not in passing. Not in whispers. Not even in warning. It was as if she had never existed. But her presence lingered. In the places they used to sit. In the path she once took through the courtyard. In the broken relic tucked into a corner of the library where her handwriting still marked a half-translated rune. Gravus said nothing, not to anyone. But when he entered the arena that day, the students stopped sparring. He didn't order them to. They just knew. He stepped onto the floor without invitation, drew a practice blade, and pointed at the strongest of them. "Come," he said. The fight lasted seconds. Gravus moved without effort. Not angry, not wild, just precise. The strike landed clean across the student's chest, deep enough to break the skin. Blood hit the sand, but no scream followed. Gravus turned to the next, then the next. One by one, they fell. He didn't speak, didn't gloat, didn't pause. When it was over, 7 students lay in the dust, groaning or unconscious. He dropped the blade without ceremony and walked away. No one followed him. From that day forward, no one challenged him again. The instructors took note. They updated his file, observed behavioral change, elevated threat level, recommend reassignment. None of it mattered. He had changed. Not upward, not forward, inward. That night, he returned to the chamber where she used to read. The corner still held her scent, soft parchment and temple dust. A candle stub remained where she had once traced words into the air with her finger, believing sound could linger even when the tongue fell silent. He sat there, and for the first time in years, he closed his eyes and wanted to remember. Not what she looked like, but what he felt in her presence. The steadiness, the ache of recognition, the impossible hope that there might be more to this path than survival. That someone might see him and not turn away. He lit the candle, and when it burned down to the wick, he didn't move. He waited, not for her, not for comfort, but for silence, the deep kind, the one that held weight. That night, the tombs whispered differently, not in hunger, not in demand, but in acknowledgement, as if the darkness itself had felt her loss, as if it knew what had been taken. Over the next few weeks, things began to vanish. Scrolls, holocrons, students. An instructor assigned to her final evaluation fell from the observation tower. Another disappeared after entering the lower vault. No one connected the events, but those who still remembered her name never spoke it again. And Gravus, he didn't seek revenge, he became it. Not through violence, not through chaos, through absence. He removed things quietly, without signature, without sound, like ash dissolving before it touched the ground. And the Academy learned something that day. Not all storms are loud. Some arrive when everything is already broken, and all they do is settle the dust. But this time, the ash didn't settle. It stayed in the air, thick, heavy, unfinished, because the part of him she saw, the one she named, was gone. Buried, not by hate, not by time, but by silence. He never asked for power. It simply stopped belonging to others. In the months after her disappearance, Gravus became colder than anyone expected. But it wasn't rage that moved him forward. It was space. A quiet, widening space between him and everyone else. One overseer stepped too close during a ritual inspection. The next day, he was reassigned to the outer systems, citing incompatibility with Gravus's methods. Another Sith Lord attempted to discipline Gravus in front of the younger acolytes. She died in her sleep 2 nights later. No signs of struggle, just a look of fear frozen into her face. Her chamber doors were still sealed from the inside. No one accused Gravus. No one needed to. He did not rise through duel or declaration. He simply remained when others fell. He did not fill their seat. He stood in their place until the galaxy adjusted. The Sith call it succession, but in his case, it was subtraction. And still, he never smiled. Darth Gravus did not claim a title during his ascension. He didn't kneel before the council. He didn't carve his name into stone. He walked into his new role the same way he had walked into every room since Coraban, without sound. And yet, the others made room for him. Not out of fear, not out of respect, out of discomfort. Because he did not act like the Sith they were used to. He didn't preach doctrine. He didn't celebrate victories. He didn't even indulge in cruelty. He just moved. The younger Sith began whispering new names for him. The Cold Flame, the Void Walker, the Wound that Breathes. But none of those names stayed. Because Gravus didn't burn. He didn't walk. He didn't bleed. He erased. Not just people but presence. Entire spaces felt emptier after he passed through. Voices quieted. Conversations ended. Plans were redrawn. Even ambition seemed to shrink in his shadow. It wasn't because he was stronger. It was because he was clearer. There was no desire behind his eyes. No need to prove anything. No hunger to climb higher. And that made him impossible to predict and impossible to control. He didn't need approval. He didn't seek alliance. And he had no weaknesses left. Whatever name he'd been born with was gone. Whatever master had shaped him was dust. Whatever heart had once made him pause had been buried with her. And in that emptiness, Gravus became something more dangerous than powerful. He became necessary. When civil conflicts erupted between rival Sith factions, the council turned to him not for diplomacy, but for silence. And each time he returned, the rebellion didn't just end. It vanished. No records, no prisoners, no celebrations, just stillness. It was said that when Darth Gravus eliminated a dissident enclave on Bastarda, he left their temples standing but stripped them of sound. The walls absorbed echo. The wind refused to blow. And no one there spoke his name again. The Sith High Council took notice. They didn't honor him, didn't praise him. They simply began deferring to him in moments of uncertainty. They asked him to attend more gatherings, assigned him strategic posts, trusted him with artifacts they feared to unlock. Because Gravus didn't ascend by claiming authority, he became authority by never asking for it. And in the Sith Order, where ambition was everything, that made him unforgettable, not because of what he said, but because he never needed to speak. His first campaign was not broadcast. No declarations, no banners, no theatrics. Just coordinates. A moon in the Retribution sector had declared independence from the Sith-controlled corridor. The local temple claimed neutrality. The Jedi were rumored to be watching. The council debated the response for days. Gravus ended it in 3 hours. He arrived with a small fleet, not the largest, not the loudest, just enough to be mistaken for a diplomatic force. He never hailed the surface, never sent demands, never asked for surrender. He waited. When their sensors scanned his fleet and found no aggression, they relaxed. That was their mistake. He began with the comm towers, Not destroyed, disabled. Quietly. Precisely. Then the shields. Then the transport pads. By the time the temple tried to respond, their corridors were already venting air. Their sentries were unconscious. Their council was missing. No survivors were reported. The Jedi didn't retaliate. Because the Jedi never saw him. They reviewed sensor data, tracking logs, orbital rotations, and found nothing. Just a black entry in the timecode. A gap, like time had skipped. That was Gravus. He didn't invade, he erased. Not just targets, but cause, memory, context. The Sith began assigning him to systems too delicate for open war. Places where negotiations had failed, but full conquest would draw too much attention. He delivered results. Every time. But it wasn't the victories that frightened his peers. It was the method. His battle plans looked like equations, not strategies. Variables were placed across maps like pieces on a board only he could read. He didn't name operations. He numbered them. Operation 0 to 4. Isolation. Operation 0 to 5. Bleed pressure. Operation 0 to 6. Silence. When asked for reasoning, he said nothing. When pressed, he responded only with results. Entire regions were destabilized with a few commands. Trade lanes collapsed overnight. Religious orders fell into infighting. Civil governments turned on themselves without knowing who had pushed them. And Gravus was never in the room when it happened. He didn't win with firepower. He won with subtraction. He removed options, removed communications, removed hope. And when the survivors surrendered, they weren't even sure to whom. One commander wrote in her final transmission, "We have not seen his face. We do not know his terms. But our decisions are no longer our own." The council praised his efficiency, but they didn't understand it. Because Gravus wasn't making war for conquest. He was making it clean. The Sith had always viewed violence as a spectacle, a way to dominate, to break, to announce. Gravus viewed violence as a correction. When a variable misbehaved, you removed it. Not loudly, not cruelly, just, precisely. And when it was done, you didn't stand over the fallen. You walked away. Because war wasn't art. It wasn't theater. It was math. And he was very, very good at it. His officers adapted quickly. They stopped expecting speeches. They stopped waiting for strategy briefings. He delivered his commands in short bursts, through encrypted channels, with no emotional tone. Execute protocol. Hold orbit, leave the remains. They obeyed not because they feared punishment, but because he didn't threaten them. And that made obedience feel like gravity. You didn't resist. You simply fell into it. One admiral once asked him after a successful strike, "Was that the outcome you expected?" Gravus turned slowly. "It was the only outcome possible," he said, and walked away. They called him commander, but he gave no speeches, no rally cries, no affirmations, no moments of shared victory. Gravus did not inspire. He calibrated. His captains never knew what he was thinking. He didn't explain his orders. He delivered them as if they were already written, as if the outcome had been decided before they boarded the ship. And in time, they stopped asking why. Because every time he issued a command, it worked. He led from the bridge, but rarely from the center. He preferred quiet corners, standing near observation windows, watching, calculating. When other Sith Lords arrived to oversee campaigns, they found nothing to critique. His records were flawless, collateral was minimal, outcomes were clean, but they left uneasy. Because Gravus didn't speak of conquest. He didn't seem to want anything. Not credits, not recognition, not territory. He moved through the war like a ghost playing out a pattern he no longer believed in, but still understood perfectly. One captain once asked him, during the siege of Telbor III, "What should we do with the surviving monks?" Gravus didn't turn from the viewport. "Nothing," he said. The captain waited. "Let them leave." "No, do nothing. They will choose." And they did. 3 days later, the monks destroyed their own temple and walked into the desert. No one understood how he'd known, but he always knew. He had seen patterns no one else could see. Not through prophecy, not through the Force, through observation, through silence. He watched the way people moved when no one was looking, the hesitation in their orders, the weight in their silences, the moment before a lie, and the breath that came after it. And in those small human flaws, he found advantage. He didn't exploit them with cruelty. He simply made them irrelevant. His enemies began to report strange effects before his assaults. Officers described feeling watched days before Gravus's fleets arrived. Supply lines failed without cause. Droids refused to respond to input. Strategic defenses turned inward, as if confused. Some claimed they'd seen him in dreams. Always silent, always still, never killing, just watching. He did not leave trophies. He did not keep prisoners. But he always left something. A symbol carved into stone. A broken staff placed in a governor's chair. A single data file left unlocked, with no words, only a list of names, all of them crossed out. What it meant was never clear, only that someone had been there, and he had not forgotten. But beneath the precision, there was memory, not of victory, of loss. Gravus carried his silence like a wound that never healed. Those who served under him learned to recognize the signs. When the lights dimmed on the command deck for no reason. When the comms crackled without interference. When he stared too long at a single point in space, unmoving. That meant something had been remembered. And when that happened, it was best to speak softly, or not at all. Because Gravus didn't act from hate, he acted from absence. Not a void created by power. A void left by someone who used to fill the silence. And so his orders came without emotion. Because there was no emotion left. Just movement. Just decision. Just the cold knowledge of what must be done. And what could no longer be saved. He was called before the High Council only once. Not to be judged, not to be questioned, but to be seen. They didn't know what to make of him. He had ended 3 rebellions in the Outer Rim without a single Sith casualty. He'd shut down a Jedi-aligned supply corridor by collapsing 4 trade guilds with a single transmission. He had destabilized 6 Force cults without ever stepping onto their worlds. But Gravus never claimed responsibility. He filed no reports, he delivered no speeches, he accepted no rewards. When he entered the council chamber, he did so alone. No guards, no escort, no ceremony. He wore black robes with no crest, no mask, no armor. Just a datapad in his hand, already cleared of memory. The Dark Lords studied him like a relic they had forgotten they possessed. They asked him questions. He answered only when required. They asked what he believed in. He didn't reply. They asked what his goals were. He said only, stability. They asked who had trained him. He gave no name. One of the newer lords, young, ambitious, loud, leaned forward and asked, "Do you serve the dark side?" Gravus looked at him, not with anger, but with distance. "I serve what remains," he said. The council fell silent. That was the moment they understood. Gravus was not a creature of hunger, not a warlord, not a mystic. He was aftermath. The shape left behind when the fire burned out. The sound the blade made after it stopped moving. The stillness that followed too much loss, too much clarity, too much truth. They didn't vote to elevate him. They didn't offer him a new title. They simply stopped assigning him targets. Because Gravus didn't need assignments. He had already decided where the next war would end. He spent the following year in transit not as a wanderer, but as a consequence. He visited the vaults on Malachor, stood alone in the frost of Oricon, walked the glass fields of Dromund Kars where lightning had not touched in decades. He did not speak of her, but every world he touched carried echoes of what had been taken from him. The tombs responded to him differently now, not with hunger, with reverence. They opened not to challenge him, but to welcome him, not as a successor, but as one of their own. Because Gravus was no longer walking the path of a Sith, he was becoming the memory of it. In time, even his enemies began to question if he had ever truly existed. Jedi who survived his campaigns refused to speak of what they saw. Admirals reported anomalies they couldn't explain. Droids malfunctioned in his presence, not from sabotage, from fear they didn't know how to describe. He attended war councils in silence. He sat on strategy forums without offering a word. But when his eyes landed on a planet in the hologram, everyone knew which one would fall. His presence was not a command, it was a conclusion. By the time the archives officially recorded him as Darth Gravus, most assumed he had been one for years. But titles didn't matter. He had never smiled, never boasted, never reached out for more. And yet he had more power than anyone could see. Because he did not wield it, he was it. Not a storm, not a shadow, but the fire's final breath. The moment when everything has already burned, and what's left refuses to be forgotten. It began without warning. No declaration, no fleet in orbit, no message sent across hyperspace, just silence. Then, one by one, Jedi outposts went dark. At first, the Order believed it was interference, solar storms, disrupted beacons, faulty relays. But the pattern was too precise, too clean. There were no distress calls, no escape pods, no survivors. Gravus had not declared war. He had started removing things. The campaign didn't have a name, not officially, not until much later, when those who remembered were forced to call it something. Most used the term the Gravus campaign, but that was misleading. It wasn't a campaign. It was a disappearance. Entire planets were left untouched, cities still standing, populations unharmed. But Jedi temples, gone, not destroyed, not bombed, just erased. No rubble, no fire, no remains. Just absence. The first recorded loss was a sanctuary on Mihelari Prime. 5 Jedi resided there. 2 knights, 3 Padawans. They had no military presence, no known strategic value. When the next Republic vessel arrived, the temple was sealed. No bodies, no lights. Just a building with all the doors welded shut from the inside, and a single phrase etched into the durasteel wall. "We were never here." By the time the Council recognized the threat, Gravus had already reached his 6th system, but they couldn't trace him. There were no hyperspace logs, no active fleets, no traceable energy signatures. Gravus didn't move like a commander. He moved like a correction. Some Jedi argued it wasn't him. That Gravus was a myth, a false flag, an illusion crafted by the Sith to breed paranoia. But the pattern continued. Outer Rim listening posts fell silent. Refugee worlds known to house wounded Jedi were wiped clean. Even encrypted holonet channels began to fail transmissions, looping back on themselves as if deliberately rewritten. It wasn't just killing. It was erasure. The Jedi were unprepared for it. They had prepared for war sieges, betrayals, armies of Sith rising with red blades and fury. But Gravus brought none of that. He didn't strike with emotion. He struck with abstraction, as if he were removing numbers from an equation instead of lives from a map. Even the Jedi shadows, the ones trained to hunt Sith, failed to find him. One was recorded saying, "He's not there. Not in the Force. Not in the dark. Not anywhere." And then, she was gone too. The Republic attempted to intervene, but Gravus never gave them a target. He never held territory, never built a fortress, never stayed in one system long enough for coordinates to matter. The Council sent probes, scouts, diplomatic envoys. None returned, but the civilians remained untouched. Gravus wasn't hunting governments. He wasn't seeking control. He was targeting memory. Because Jedi temples weren't just places, they were repositories of teachings, of lineage, of truth. And by removing them, Gravus wasn't simply weakening the Order. He was thinning its identity. The Jedi began meeting in secret, using old names, disguising their robes, burying their lightsabers. Not because they were losing, but because they were being forgotten. The only record of Gravus during this phase comes from a scout droid recovered on Var. It shows a single figure standing in the ashes of a hollow temple. No weapon drawn, no movement, just standing, watching. The image is blurry, distorted, but it's enough. Enough to confirm what everyone already feared. Gravus was not leading a war. He was ending one, by making sure it had never started. Gravus didn't burn worlds, he emptied them. From orbit, the cities looked untouched. Farms still worked their soil. Children still played in streets. Power grids pulsed with life. But when the Jedi arrived, when they followed distress signals or ancient force markers, they found silence. Not ruins, not graves. Just places where something was supposed to be, and wasn't. There was no evidence of conflict, no signs of combat, no struggle. Even the Force itself felt thinner, like someone had drawn a blade across history and wiped away the moment it happened. What made it worse was the selectiveness. Civilians were never harmed. Medical droids were still operational. Administrative networks still functioned, but everything tied to Jedi presence, holocrons, scrolls, kyber crystals, training grounds, was gone. Even the dust where a lightsaber had once rested had been swept away. Gravus wasn't erasing the Jedi. He was erasing the memory of them. On Tolov Minor, a planetary survey found a carved stone chamber with no door. Beneath it, an entire sublevel had been removed, cut clean from the bedrock. No damage to the structure, no signs of tools, just an absence. The archives called it a perfect sever. But the Jedi who had trained there were never found. Not dead, not captured, just gone. Gravus didn't need fleets. He used transports modified for low-orbit stealth. Black vessels that emitted no signal, often registered as meteorological debris. He worked through relay agents, silent teams of masked acolytes who never spoke his name. They didn't kill unless required. They didn't conquer unless ordered. They simply extracted, deleted, moved on. Even when Jedi tried to defend a temple, Gravus avoided open conflict. He would wait. Not days, weeks. He allowed tension to build. He let fear wear them down. The longer they stayed in one place, the more fragile they became. Supplies dwindled, morale shattered. The force itself bent strangely around them. And then the lights would fail. The temperature would drop, and by morning the temple would be empty. Sometimes the defenders were still alive, but they didn't remember why they were there. They would awaken in fields, in forests, aboard drifting ships, disoriented, disconnected, no memory of how they'd left. Their connection to the Force frayed, like something had gnawed at it from the inside. The Jedi called it hollowing. It was never explained. Because Gravus didn't attack the Jedi's bodies, he broke their narrative. He understood something few Sith ever grasped. That identity was the true pillar of the Order. Not strength, not wisdom, continuity. And if you could make a Jedi question what they were protecting, they would falter. Not all at once, but in pieces. The Jedi archives began to adjust their records. Entire names were removed from lineage chains. Masters who had trained generations were now listed as lost. Temples, once recorded in high-precision maps, were marked unknown coordinates. It wasn't sabotage. It was design. Even the Force struggled to trace Gravus. He didn't broadcast rage. He didn't radiate hatred. He moved with a calm so absolute, it made the currents of the Force fold around him. By the time they tried to track him through meditative councils, it was already too late. He had already moved on. And what he left behind wasn't ruin. It was doubt. The kind that didn't destroy a Jedi with fire, but with silence. The kind that made them ask, quietly, were we ever there at all? The first Jedi to track him was Master Renovar, a seer, a diplomat, a man who believed no darkness was truly invisible. He followed the disappearances across 6 sectors, mapping out the vanishing points of Gravus's campaign. Each location formed a pattern, a looping curve across the outer rim, a shape Renovar recognized from ancient warnings. He meditated for 3 days before speaking the truth aloud. He is not hiding from us. He is removing the path to reach him. Renovar assembled a small strike team. No Padawans, no knights untested by loss. Only those who understood how silence could wound deeper than a blade. They jumped to the world of Taran IV, where a temple had fallen dark just hours before. They arrived too late. The temple wasn't destroyed, its history was. Rooms were intact, doors unbroken, food untouched. But every holocron was melted from within, as if the knowledge had been burned out of the crystal without heat. Renovar walked deeper. The Force felt hollow, not empty, scraped clean. Like someone had reached into the current and removed the memory of what had happened. And then he felt something. A presence. Not hiding, not hostile. Just observing. He turned and saw no one. "The Sith is near," whispered one of his knights. Renovar closed his eyes. "No," he said. "Something else." They searched the grounds. Hours passed. Shadows shifted. The wind began to mirror their breathing. But they found nothing. Until the knight at the rear of the formation stopped moving. He didn't fall. He didn't speak. He simply froze. His eyes were wide, staring at something behind Renovar. When the master turned, he saw only stone. No enemy. No figure. No Gravus. Just a single mark carved into the wall. A circle. Incomplete. Broken at the top. Renovar recognized it. a symbol of severance used by ancient Sith to indicate a space where the Force no longer obeyed memory. The knight who had frozen collapsed moments later, still alive, still breathing. But when Renovar said his name, the knight didn't recognize it, didn't recognize Renovar, didn't recognize his own identity. Gravus had never touched him, but something had. When the strike team finally regrouped, one asked, "Master, what are we fighting?" Renovar answered truthfully, "A man who has become a question." Word of the encounter reached the Jedi Council. They doubled their efforts, sent more teams, deployed trackers, prophets, psychometric analysts. But the more they searched, the less they found. Every attempt to sense Gravus through the Force failed. It wasn't a block, it wasn't a disguise. It wasn't even a void. It was nothing. Like he wasn't a participant in the Force anymore, merely a place where it hesitated, unsure what shape to take. Jedi tasked with following him returned confused, sickened, or silent. Some stopped speaking entirely. Others claimed something had watched them from behind their own thoughts. One report simply read, "He is nowhere, and that is where he kills." The council tried to anticipate his next strike. But Gravus didn't strike. He removed. He acted without pattern, without emotion, without presence. He wasn't clouded by anger or ambition, the usual anchors by which the Jedi sensed their enemies. He had become a practitioner of absence, a weapon built from what wasn't there. And in time, the Jedi realized something far more frightening than any Sith uprising. You cannot defend against a shadow you cannot remember. By the time Gravus's next fleet moved, the Jedi Order wasn't preparing for battle. They were preparing for forgetting. By the end of the campaign, even the Sith stopped tracking his movements. They didn't need to. The signs were always the same. A star system would grow quiet. An enclave would vanish. And Gravus would never appear in the reports. Because there was nothing to report. The Jedi tried to warn each other. But their warnings came too late, not because they were intercepted, but because they were erased. Messages never arrived. Names disappeared from archives. Mission records showed blank manifests where Jedi had once stood. It was not sabotage. It was precision. Gravus didn't kill Jedi to make a point. He didn't broadcast victories. He didn't desecrate the temples. He unwrote them. He didn't believe in domination. He believed in stillness, one that could not be broken, because it carried no weight, no edge, just absence. He knew the Jedi better than they expected. He understood what they feared most wasn't pain, it was loss of meaning. So he removed their meaning. One night was found adrift in a disabled freighter. Weeks after her order had assumed her dead, she was uninjured. Her lightsaber still intact. But when rescued, she couldn't recall what system she'd left from, or who her master had been, or why she carried a weapon she didn't remember building. When asked what happened, she whispered, "There was nothing," and began to cry. Gravus was no longer conducting a war. He was conducting an unmaking. The Jedi Council fell into silence of its own. Strategic meetings turned to memorials. Teaching halls stood half-filled. The younger Padawans stopped asking questions, because no one wanted to know who was next. Entire generations of masters were lost not to battle but to silence, as if they had been plucked from history and folded into the void Gravus carried with him. He didn't hunt. He revised. And as each new strike came quiet, precise, nameless, the Jedi began to realize they were losing something worse than territory. They were losing memory. Of the lessons, of the lineages, of themselves. And Gravus said nothing. No declarations. No threats, no final message. Because this was never about fear. It was about completion. One of his final recorded actions during the campaign was the sterilization of the temple at Ares Tala. It was a minor sanctuary, long forgotten, buried into the cliffs of a rain-soaked world. When Republic scouts arrived weeks later, they found the temple still standing. But inside, all the walls were blank. The murals, once carved with ancient Jedi prophecy, had been sanded smooth. The artifacts were gone, and in the center of the main chamber sat a single stone chair. Nothing else. When analyzed, the walls emitted no echo, not in sound, not in the force, as if the place had refused to remember what it once held. Gravus had left no mark, because he didn't need to. Those who walked through that place afterward described it the same way. This wasn't destruction, it was grief. But Gravus did not grieve. He moved on. To the next system, the next fault in the map, the next trace of Jedi history that had dared to survive. And one by one, they were silenced. Not by fear, not by fire, but by a man who no longer needed the Force to find his targets. Only the knowledge of where they believed they were safe, and what they thought would be remembered. Gravus never wanted an apprentice. He didn't speak of legacy. He didn't plan for succession. He didn't need a second voice repeating his own. But silence has gravity, and even in the coldest void, something follows. The boy was never named, at least not by Gravus. The records that mention him do so only in fragments, an observer, a shadow, one of his. He wasn't selected, he wasn't trained, he just watched. At first, from a distance sitting outside war rooms where Gravus spoke to no one. Then from closer silent corridors, ship bridges, fallen temples. He was always just behind him, never speaking, never blinking, and Gravus never told him to leave. Perhaps that was permission, or perhaps it was just inertia. He was small, sharp, quiet, not gifted in the Force, not by comparison. His early evaluations were incomplete, his skill with a blade clumsy. But what he was present, endlessly, without demand, without hesitation. And that was what Gravus tolerated. Because unlike the others, those who shouted for recognition or bled for approval, this one never asked to be seen. He simply absorbed. He watched Gravus unmake Jedi enclaves, saw him draw war down into silence, learn not through teachings, but through stillness. Over time, he mirrored it. He stopped speaking, stopped sleeping near the others, stopped reacting when punished. Some assumed Gravus had begun training him in secret. But Gravus offered nothing. No instruction, no tasks, no words of affirmation. He simply allowed the boy to walk where he walked, stand where he stood, wait in the rooms he left behind. And slowly, the boy stopped being a boy. Not through transformation, through subtraction. His name faded, first whispers replaced it with the quiet one, his echo, the second silence. Then went his face, hoods drawn lower, masks worn longer, presence dimmed until people weren't sure if he'd ever actually been there. Then, finally, went his identity, not erased by violence, not burned by ritual, just forgotten. Even Gravus, when questioned, didn't confirm him. He never said, "my apprentice," never claimed him, never corrected the title. He didn't need to. Because whatever this figure had become, it belonged to Gravus now. Not by oath, by reflection. Where Gravus walked, the shadow followed. Where Gravus looked, the shadow paused. And when Gravus destroyed, The shadow watched with empty eyes, studying every movement like a forgotten memory. Some Sith whispered that the boy was an extension, a clone, a fracture of Gravus himself, cut from some ritual long lost to the archives. Others believed he was simply another casualty, broken so completely by Gravus's presence that he reformed as a mirror. Both were wrong, and both were right. Because this apprentice, if he could be called that, was not learning, he was becoming. Not in power, not in strength, but in absence. And Gravus never stopped him. Not because he approved, because it didn't matter. He knew where the path ended, and so did the boy, even if neither of them would speak it aloud. There were no lessons, not formally, not verbally, not in any way the Sith would recognize. Gravus never summoned the boy for training, never corrected his stance or his breath, never placed a weapon in his hands and demanded mastery. And yet, the apprentice learned. He learned everything, not through instruction, but through exposure, through the quiet brutality of watching Gravus move through the galaxy as if every action were a calculation, and every calculation a form of truth. The boy learned that silence could break a room faster than screaming. He learned that stillness could be a weapon sharper than a blade. He learned that listening, not commanding, was how Gravus bent others to his will. The Sith Academy had tried to teach him rage. Gravus taught him nothing, and somehow, that taught him more. He followed Gravus into ruined temples, walking behind him like a shadow stitched to his heel. He watched the way Gravus touched nothing, disturbed nothing, yet left every room changed. He memorized the pace of Gravus's steps, slow, deliberate, steady, never hurried, as though each moment had already been lived. He mirrored that pace until others could not tell them apart when they heard the footsteps. He observed Gravus reading relics without touching them, studying ruins without expression, speaking to subordinates without raising his voice, yet leaving them trembling when he walked away. The boy practiced that too, badly at first, then perfectly. When one overseer backhanded him for his silence, the boy didn't flinch, he didn't react. He simply blinked once, slowly, exactly the way Gravus did. The overseer never touched him again. When other acolytes mocked him, the boy stared past them, as though they were ghosts speaking languages no longer relevant to the living. They stopped mocking him. And when Gravus issued an order to his officers, short, quiet, without emotion, the boy repeated those same orders in an empty room, shaping his breath to match the same rhythm, the same distance from feeling. Not to imitate, to become. His blade technique evolved the same way through observation. He saw Gravus spar only twice, each time ending the fight before the opponent realized it had begun. The boy practiced those motions alone, hours, days, repeating the same minimal strikes, reducing every gesture until nothing was wasted. He trained himself until his blade movements were whisper-thin and hollow smooth. He became effective, but never expressive. And that was the problem. He was not learning Gravus's strengths. He was learning Gravus's damage. That was the part no one saw. Not the Sith Lords, not the officers, not the archivists who whispered about the boy in Gravus's shadow. They didn't see how he stopped eating unless Gravus did. How he slept sitting upright, copying the posture Gravus used during long flights. How he refused to speak because Gravus rarely did, until eventually he forgot the sound of his own voice. He didn't understand Gravus's silence. He only repeated it. He didn't understand Gravus's calm. He only wore it, like armor far too heavy for him to lift. Like a mask he didn't know how to remove. Over time, the boy's presence became unsettling, even to the Sith. Not powerful, not dangerous, just empty. Completely emptied out by proximity to a man who had already lost too much. A man whose silence was carved from trauma, not choice. A man who had never wanted to be followed. But the boy followed anyway. Because in Gravus, he saw everything he feared, and everything he wished to become. And that was the tragedy. Gravus was not a teacher, but the boy became a student nonetheless. Not shaped by instruction, shaped by void. Gravus disappeared the same way he had always arrived. Without sound, without explanation, without leaving anything behind that could be followed. One day, the fleet returned from an operation on the Outer Rim. Gravus did not. There was no final order, no transmission, no trace in the Force. His chamber was empty, his command deck untouched, his last datapad erased, and in the absence, the boy remained. He didn't ask where Gravus had gone. He didn't demand answers, he didn't speak. Because by then, he no longer knew how. The other Sith expected him to fade, to collapse, to disintegrate without the presence he had built himself around. But he didn't. He continued, without authorization, without leadership, without recognition. He wore Gravus's silence like a robe too heavy for his shoulders. He activated ships without command codes. He issued orders in gestures and glares. And the soldiers, those who had once served Gravus, obeyed him out of reflex. Because in him, they heard the echo of something they still feared. He carried Gravus's absence like a memory trying to become flesh. And he began to move through the galaxy, not as a Sith, but as an echo. He didn't call it a campaign. He didn't announce his purpose. But planets began to vanish from the map again. Not with fire, not with screams, with deletion. He repeated Gravus's patterns, reached the same coordinates, even visited systems Gravus had already erased, as if trying to remember what had been taken. And each time, he left behind less of himself. Witnesses described a figure in dark robes, always alone, never speaking. Some claimed he projected no presence in the Force. Others said he radiated something colder than the void. He did not kill as cleanly as Gravus. He was less precise, more erratic. But the effect was the same. Temples stripped bare, holocrons gone, names removed from the galactic record. Jedi found walking in circles, unable to remember why they had landed. He was not Gravus, but he had memorized him, and in doing so, had forgotten who he used to be. If he had ever been anyone at all. The Sith took notice, but none dared stop him. Because he didn't seem to serve their hierarchy. He didn't challenge their power. He simply passed through, leaving them changed, confused, uncertain. Like Gravus, but not Gravus. Because Gravus had purpose, the boy only had pattern. A ritual with no altar. A ghost without a grave. Some believed he was trying to summon Gravus back. Others believed he thought he was Gravus reborn, or unfinished. But the truth was simpler. He didn't want to replace Gravus. He wanted to understand why he had been left behind. And so he retraced every step. Not to win, not to conquer, but to follow the silence back to its source, and maybe disappear into it. He left no name, no code, no symbol, just the rhythm of Gravus's war, played one note too late. And as he moved farther from the Sith, farther from his own history, he became something even Gravus never was. An echo of an echo. A shadow that didn't know who it belonged to. A voice without a master, repeating a language it never truly spoke. It ended where it always had to. Not in fire, not in battle, but in return. The apprentice, nameless and unraveling, followed the last thread of Gravus's path to a world no longer on any star map. It had no known population, no military value, no temple. But the air felt familiar. There was no welcoming fleet, no guards, no defenses, only ruins and silence. He walked alone, his robes tattered, his breath shallow. The wind didn't touch him. The force didn't answer him. But still, he knew. This was the place. Not where Gravus had died. Where Gravus had ended, the terrain was ash-covered. Black stone fractured by time. The bones of a forgotten structure rose against a dead sky, something ancient, something unfinished. At the center of the ruin, a circle had been carved into the stone. Incomplete. The same symbol that had followed Gravus from system to system. A broken loop, a severed cycle. The apprentice knelt at its edge, not to meditate, to listen. And for the first time in years, something answered. Not in words, in weight. A presence, deeper than thought, older than pain. Not watching him, waiting for him. He closed his eyes. And Gravus was there. Not physically, not visibly, but completely. Not a ghost, not a memory, just gravity. The apprentice did not speak. He had forgotten how. But he reached, slowly, with the force not to touch, but to receive. And what he found was not instruction. It was a grave. Gravus had buried himself here. Not his body, his voice, his will, his final silence. Not as a declaration, but as a decision. He had ended his own campaign not with triumph, but with absence. Because he had seen what followed him, and knew it would not stop unless he did. The apprentice stood. His hands trembled. He walked into the circle and sat at its center. For hours, maybe days, no ships came. No transmissions found him. And when he rose again, he was not a Sith. He was not anything. But he understood. Gravus had never wanted an heir. He had never taught, never guided, because he knew what he carried could not be passed down, only reflected, only copied, only mourned. The apprentice gathered a stone from the edge of the ruin. He carved the symbol deeper, finished the circle. A single movement, clean, final. Then, beside it, he carved one more line. Not a name, not a title, just a marker. Because some silences deserve to be remembered. When he stood, the force around him didn't tremble. It stilled. He walked away. Not in triumph, not in sorrow, just forward. Some say he was never seen again. Others believe he returned to the Sith under a different name. A few whisper he became something worse. But the truth is quieter. He stopped seeking Gravus, because he had found him. Not in power, not in ritual, but in the place where all echoes end, where silence becomes final, and where memory becomes a grave. She had not spoken his name in years, not because she feared him, not because she hated him, because she understood him, and that made her the only one left. Darth Solins lived alone now, buried deep beneath the surface of a forgotten moon in the Dantas sector. Her fortress was more tomb than temple, walls grown heavy with dust, corridors curled inward like the ribs of something long dead. She had once ruled entire sectors with nothing but silence and ritual. Now she ruled only memory, and memory was loud. She felt his arrival before the sensors did. No alarms, no ships on approach, just a shift in temperature, a subtle stillness in the flame, as though the force itself had paused to listen. She didn't rise to greet him. She didn't run. She just waited, because Solins had taught Gravus everything she shouldn't have. Not power, not cruelty, but how to become unseen. He stepped into the chamber like a shadow, remembering how to breathe. No footsteps echoed. No cloak moved. Just the presence of someone who no longer needed to prove he was real. She looked older than he remembered. The staff she once carried was now a cane. Her eyes dimmer. Her skin thinned from too many years, bending the Force into unnatural shapes. But when she saw him, her expression didn't change. "You're late," she said. He said nothing. "You always were," she added. Still, no response. She gestured to the stone bench across from her. He sat, not slowly, not ceremonially, just deliberately. They remained there in silence, two Sith, one former, one something else. It had been over a decade since their last words. Gravus had become myth in that time. A ghost used to frighten acolytes into obedience. A name removed from council records. Whispered only in places where the Force refused to reach. And now he was here, not to challenge, not to punish, to ask. But even now, he didn't speak right away. Solins studied him carefully. "You've come to bury something," she said. "I can feel it." His eyes met hers. Calm, cold. She nodded. "Or maybe, to bury me." No reply. She stood, slowly, walked toward the window, where sunlight fell through broken stone like shards of memory. "You never wanted to become," she said. "You wanted to disappear, and somehow, the galaxy gave you power for it." She turned back to him. "But that's not why you're here." At last, he spoke. "What am I becoming?" 4 words. But they struck her like a blade. Because she had always known this day would come. The day when the thing she had shaped would return, not for guidance, but for confirmation. She looked at him for a long time, and said only, "You already know." He didn't move. Because she was right. He did know, but knowing wasn't enough. He had come to hear it. Spoken aloud. In the voice of the only one left who remembered him before the war, before the silence, before the echo. She sat again, slower this time, and waited for him to ask the second question, the one he hadn't spoken yet, the one buried beneath all the silence he carried. But it wouldn't come, not yet, because before truth is spoken, there must be loss. And Gravus had one more piece left to lose. Solins had never feared death, but she feared irrelevance. For decades, she had watched Gravus's shadow spreading across the galaxy, first in whispers, then in war, then in something far colder. She heard the reports, the silence he left behind, the Jedi who vanished not from battle, but from memory. She knew exactly what he was becoming. Because she had seen the first fracture inside him, the day she struck him and he did not react. And now, sitting across from him again, she saw how that fracture had widened. He was not angry, not curious, not uncertain. He was empty. His question still hung in the air. "What am I becoming?" Solins exhaled slowly, as though steadying herself before facing a truth too sharp to touch. "You are becoming what the ancient Sith feared," she said. "Not a warrior, not a lord. A silence the Force cannot answer." Gravus did not flinch. "You erased worlds," she continued. "Not their people, their purpose, their memory. Even the Jedi cannot feel your presence anymore." He stared at her with hollow calm. "That isn't strength," she said. "It's collapse." Still, nothing from him. She leaned forward. "You think you're evolving, but you're vanishing." A long pause followed, heavy, quiet and stretched thin like the space between two dying stars. But Solins wasn't finished. She had one truth left. One she had carried like a wound since the day Gravus walked out of her chambers for the last time. "You asked what you're becoming," she said. "But you already knew the answer. You came here to ask the real question." She lowered her voice. "Can you come back?" The words struck like gravity collapsing around him. His eyes shifted barely, but enough for her to see the flicker of something he had buried long ago. Fear, not of her, of the void inside him. Because somewhere beneath the precision, the power, the endless stillness, Gravus remembered what it meant to be someone. And someone had been taken from him. The silence between them deepened. Solins continued, softer now. "I taught you how to listen to the dark, but I didn't teach you how to stop." She sat back, trembling slightly. "You were never meant to become this. I didn't shape you. I broke you." Her voice cracked, not with sorrow, but with clarity. "And you kept every broken piece." Gravus looked down at his hands, not in regret, in acknowledgement, as though confirming the truth he had carried for years without daring to confront it. Solins stood again, her shoulders heavy. "You want me to tell you you're still a man," she said, "that you can return from this." She shook her head. "I can't." He raised his eyes, not desperate, just listening. "You are beyond the old ways now," she said. "Beyond the Sith, beyond the Jedi. The Force cannot shape what it cannot feel, and it can no longer feel you." She stepped closer. "This is the truth," she whispered. "The one I refused to tell myself. You surpassed me long ago, but not upward." Her hand hovered inches from his face. "You surpassed me downward, into emptiness, into a place where nothing can follow." The force around them dimmed, as if it, too, understood. Solins's next words came out like a confession carved into stone. "You didn't come here for guidance. You came here for validation." Another pause. "And now you have it." Gravus inhaled once quiet, steady. For the first time in years, he looked human. But only for a breath. Then it was gone, and Solins knew what would come next. Not vengeance, not wrath, the end, because some truths cost more than life. They cost the right to remain in memory. She didn't run. When the moment came, when the silence between them broke not with words, but with understanding, Solins simply nodded. She had seen enough of the future in her lifetime to know when it arrived early. She turned from him one last time, stepping to the edge of her sanctum, where a narrow slit of light cut through the broken stone above. Dust floated in the beam like suspended memory. She raised a hand and let it pass through. "This is where I end," she said quietly. Gravus said nothing. There was no tension in the room. No rising crescendo of the force. No surge of anger or hate. Just stillness. The kind that meant everything had already happened. She closed her eyes. "Do you want me to kneel?" He didn't answer. "Will it matter if I do?" Again silence. She exhaled through her nose, soft, measured, as if releasing the last of her questions into the air. For a moment she thought he might speak, might offer her some final word, a memory, a farewell, a recognition of what they once were, master and apprentice, yes, but something stranger, too. But Gravus had nothing left to give, and that was her answer. He wasn't angry, he wasn't grieving, he was resolved. She turned around one last time. "You are what I feared most," she said. "Not my failure, my reflection." She stepped forward once. "I do not regret teaching you." Another step. "I regret not knowing when to stop." She came to a halt before him. There was no fear in her eyes, only acceptance. Gravus reached up slowly, not with a weapon, not with the force, just an open hand. He placed his palm flat against her forehead, and held it there. The air thickened, time did not slow. The force did not scream, it simply receded. Like a tide pulling away from the shore. She didn't resist. She didn't flinch. She closed her eyes and whispered, "Let it be still." Then her body folded, not violently, not dramatically. As if gravity had remembered her bones were tired. She dropped into his arms with the grace of surrender. Not to him, to the truth. Gravus didn't breathe. He didn't tremble. He simply lowered her gently to the floor, eyes steady, posture unshaken. There was no ceremony, no ritual, just stillness. The same kind he had once learned at her feet. The same kind she had used to shape him. And now, the final lesson she had left was the one she had never taught. How to end without resistance. How to fall with meaning. How to give up control. And let the silence decide what came next. He stood over her for a long time. Not out of hesitation, out of acknowledgement. Because even though her voice had faded, her choice still echoed. Solins had not died in fear. She had died in understanding. And that made her the last person in the galaxy who had ever truly known him. Now, even that thread was cut. And Gravus felt no lighter for it. No freer, just quieter. Not the silence of peace, the silence of completion. He did not bury her. Not at first. Gravus stood over Solins's body long after the air had settled, long after the last warmth had left her skin. The room did not feel emptier. It felt finished, as though a thread pulled too tight had finally snapped. There were no tears, no anger, no satisfaction, only assessment, only acknowledgement. He knelt beside her and placed her hands at her side, not as a gesture of respect, but because symmetry mattered to him. Even now, even here, the smallest fragments of order still lived inside him, drifting like dust across a hollow floor. He looked at her face. Not searching for what had been lost, searching for what had been confirmed. Solins was gone, but the truth she had spoken remained. He was not becoming stronger. He was becoming less. Less bound, less visible, less alive. He rose without sound. The wind outside shifted. Shadows lengthened in unnatural ways, as if the force itself hesitated to move around him. He stepped into the open courtyard of the ruined stronghold and examined the ground. Barren, dry, unmarked. A place that forgot even itself. It was fitting. He extended a hand, not to summon lightning, not to crush stone, but to lift slowly, carefully, a slab of broken earth. Dust spiraled upward, suspended in breathless motion as the ground parted. He carved a space deep enough for a body, deep enough for a memory, deep enough for the last person who had ever dared speak truth to him. When the grave was ready, he returned to her. He did not lift her with reverence. He lifted her the same way he lifted anything else, precisely, efficiently, without wasted movement. He carried her outside, the light falling across her face for the final time. He lowered her into the earth. No words, no rites, no last look, just silence. He closed the grave with a single motion. The wind did not stir. The force did not ripple. Nothing marked the moment except the faint settling of dust. He stood there for a while, staring at the unmarked stone. There was no weight in his expression, no tension in his hands. Whatever emotion might have lived inside him once, whatever flicker she had touched, it had been buried with her. He had asked Solins what he was becoming. Her death was the answer. Because the force did not bend around him anymore. It shrank, as though refusing to hold shape near him, as though nothing of him remained for it to grasp. He turned away and walked back into the fortress. Every echo of his footsteps died before reaching the walls. Every shadow refused to follow him. In the dim corridor, he passed a broken mirror leaning against the stone. It had belonged to Solins once, used for rituals now forgotten. Cracks spider-webbed its surface. He stopped. For the first time since his youth, he looked into a reflection, but the glass showed nothing. No face, no hood, no outline, just fractured darkness, rippling like a void that had learned how to stand. He touched the edge of the mirror. It did not change. He left it there. When he emerged into the night, he did not look back at the grave. He did not look at the stars. He did not look at the path ahead. He simply walked. Not toward destiny. Not toward ascension. Toward dissolution. Toward the quiet shape of a legend that would never be fully understood. Toward the kind of myth that frightened even the Sith. Darth Gravus, the one who could not be reflected, the one who could not be sensed, the one who could not be named by the Force, a presence without identity, a story without a speaker, a shadow without a master, and now, a man without humanity. There was no coronation, no war council, no declaration of victory, no public execution of a rival Sith. And yet, everyone knew who ruled the Empire. It wasn't the Dark Lord who wore the robes. It wasn't the figure seated at the center of the throne chamber. It was the man who stood behind them, who spoke only when silence had finished speaking. Darth Gravus never claimed the title. He never wanted it. And that's why it bent to him more easily than it had to those who bled for it. The throne of the Empire had seen countless masters, some cruel, some brilliant, most doomed, but none had ruled it with the kind of gravity Gravus carried simply by entering the room. He didn't demand attention. He erased the need for it. The Sith Lords who filled the inner chambers of Drummond cast strategists, warriors, assassins, visionaries learned quickly that Gravus did not interrupt their plans. He made them obsolete. They began with conviction. They argued with certainty. And then he would look at them. Not speak, not threaten. Just look. And suddenly their strategy would unravel. Not because he opposed it, but because he had already accounted for its outcome 5 steps ago, and dismissed it. When Gravus walked into a war room, no one asked who had summoned him. No one asked if he belonged there. The conversation simply changed. Every breath shifted to accommodate his presence. Every calculation paused. Every projection reconsidered. He had become a kind of living audit. But he did not abuse it. He did not dominate with noise or fury. He simply corrected a misplaced assumption, a faulty premise, a move made from ego rather than need. And when he corrected someone, he did not scold them. He merely adjusted a datapad, shifted a model on a tactical table, asked a question no one else had thought to ask. And the room would go silent. Even Darth Maul, one of the few lords who still retained both respect and fear among the upper echelons, once said, "He is not a rival. He is a filter. Through him, only the correct action survives." That was Gravus, not a ruler, a consequence. The Empire, in its hunger for structure and control, found itself bending around him. Ministers stopped issuing orders until his silent approval was sensed. Warships delayed strikes by minutes, waiting for a brief update from Gravus's observatory fleet, wherever it was stationed that month. He rarely gave commands. He didn't need to. Those who sought power often found themselves stalling mid-sentence when they felt him nearby. Not because they feared retaliation, but because they feared irrelevance. His influence didn't radiate. It inverted. A gravitational pull that collapsed others into stillness, not out of submission but recognition. That here stood someone who did not fight for dominion. He existed as dominion. Not by titles, by outcome. The Sith Council debated how to deal with him more than once. Whispers passed through the halls of Kars City. Could he be removed? Could he be discredited? But every attempt to marginalize him fell apart, not through confrontation, but through invisibility. He would not respond to slander. He would not defend his position. Because he had no position to defend, he had no official title, no fortress bearing his name, no declared apprentices, no bloodline, no prophecy, and yet, when decisions needed finality, they found their way to him. When rival lords clashed, it was Gravus who often arrived not to intervene, but to observe. And when he did, the outcome always changed. Sometimes subtly, sometimes catastrophically, but always, precisely. The throne feared him not because he might claim it. It feared him because he did not need to. And those who do not need power are often the only ones capable of wielding it without distortion. Gravus never raised his voice in the imperial court, never sat where the emperors sat, never demanded the loyalty of the Dark Council. But their plans shifted when he was silent, and their fears sharpened when he was absent. Because they could plan around enemies, they could anticipate rivals. But they could not plan around Gravus, because he never entered the equation. He was the equation. And the Sith began to realize the throne was not empty. It was occupied by a ghost, a presence that no one crowned, and no one could remove. There was a pattern the Sith began to notice. Gravus would arrive late. He would stand at the edge of the room, not announced, not acknowledged, and without a word, the direction of the council would change. It began subtly. Lords who had prepared speeches would hesitate. Advisors who had built momentum would lose their rhythm. Even the Dark Council, once unshakable in presence and hierarchy, felt the shift. Like an undertow beneath still water pulling everything toward a center no one could name. Gravus didn't sit. He stood, always near a column, or behind a beam of low light, never centered, never in full view. But he listened, and that changed everything. In one meeting, a high-ranking admiral proposed a full invasion of a mid-rim sector. The room was tense. Many disagreed, but none wanted to appear weak. The vote was near unanimous, until Gravus moved. Just a step, no voice, no gesture. The admiral paused, and then, with a forced smile, withdrew the proposal. No one asked why. No one needed to. Because in the shadow of Gravus, ambition revealed itself, ego wilted, and mistakes could no longer hide. He didn't speak because he didn't need to. He understood, more than the others, more than the war strategists, more than the ministers, more than the lords. He understood the currents of fear, the shape of failure, the direction a voice leaned in when it was trying to convince itself more than the room. He saw the false motives behind true arguments, and when he did speak, it was often after hours of silence, and it was always brief. That planet no longer matters. Or, you're fighting the wrong war. Or, she will betray you. Not today. In 3 years. He never justified his words, because they didn't need justification. Time proved him right, over and over again, until even those who despised him began to wait for his judgment before finalizing their moves. There were Sith who hated him, not for what he did, but for how little he had to do. They had climbed through ritual and combat, through apprentices and titles, through scars and slaughter. Gravus had done the same, and yet now he moved through the Empire without armor, without theatrics. And he commanded more weight than they did. It was unbearable. One lord, a warrior monk from Zyast, tried to confront him during a closed session. She accused him of manipulation, of undermining the Sith code, of weakening their will. Gravus let her speak. Then, when she was done, he looked at her datapad and pointed to a single line. "You lied about your losses," he said. "The numbers don't match." She froze. No rage, no retort, just realization. That he had listened, that he had already known, that her accusation was noise. She left the room before it ended, and never returned to the council again. Gravus didn't remove her. He didn't need to. He had simply exposed the thread her authority was tied to, and it unraveled. This was his method. He wasn't political. He was surgical. He allowed ideas to form, allowed plans to expand, allowed personalities to fill the room with certainty. Then he would cut one thread, and everything would collapse on its own. The council began to change. They stopped preparing as many speeches, stopped trying to outshine one another. They began to speak in terms Gravus would respect. Precision, clarity, detachment. Not because they wanted his approval, but because they needed to be taken seriously by him. He became the mirror they feared to look into. And eventually, he became the mirror they couldn't look away from. Not because he showed them what they were, but because he showed them what they had already become. Their fear of him was not rooted in death. It was rooted in exposure. In the knowledge that Gravus would never kill you for being wrong, but he would make sure everyone else in the room saw it. And that, in the Empire, was often a far slower end. He never led the council, but the council never truly met without him. His presence became the one fixed point in a galaxy of shifting loyalties. A voice that rarely spoke, but one that reshaped the Empire every time it chose not to. The Sith Empire was not held together by banners or oaths. It was held by fear. Not fear of death or loss or even war, but the fear of being forgotten, of speaking and not being heard, of acting and not being seen. That was why Gravus mattered. He didn't just rule in silence. He ruled through absence, and that absence grew into legend. In outer systems, his name was never officially spoken, but fleet captains left one seat empty on bridge command tables, not as tradition, not as superstition, but as precaution. Because once, Gravus had arrived without warning. No manifest, no escort, no signal. He had stood behind an officer for 17 minutes before speaking. Then he said, "Fire at these coordinates instead." The officer complied. And moments later, the fleet avoided an ambush that would have crippled them. He left before they could thank him. That story was never logged, but it spread. And it changed everything. On imperial worlds like Dromund Fells and Jameis, engineering crews began issuing daily reports for Gravus's eyes, even when he was known to be light years away. The reports were never answered, but every few months, they'd receive a datapad correction. No explanation, just a location or a personnel reassignment. No one ever questioned it, because the corrections always worked. One admiral, stationed at the edge of wild space, received an anonymous message instructing him to change patrol routes by 2 degrees. He hesitated, then obeyed. 3 days later, they intercepted a Republic scouting team. The enemy had been unaware of the fleet's position because Gravus had adjusted it before they even arrived. The admiral never saw Gravus, never heard from him again, but he altered his entire command structure to report to a non-standard authority, and no one above him challenged it. Because, when Gravus moved, results followed. Even temples began to shift. Sith acolytes on Coraban were taught a new phrase, mind the silence. It meant watch what isn't said, fear what isn't taught, because that's where Gravus lived. Not in scripture, not in bloodlines, but in the spaces the Force didn't speak about. Some masters claimed he was no longer alive, that he had transcended physical form, that he existed as a wound in the Force, or that he had hidden so completely within its currents that only disaster could reveal his presence. Others said he was everywhere, that every system with order bore his mark, that every whisper of doubt in a plan came from him. And so they began to plan around his absence, which only made his influence stronger. Because they couldn't detect him, but they couldn't afford to ignore him. Even the Jedi began to wonder. Reports from Republic spies described patterns in Sith behavior. Campaigns aborted without cause, colonies reinforced just before conflict, doctrines shifted without decree, and in all of it, a shadow, a figure seen aboard ships he was never assigned to. A signal bounce on comms that came from no registered source. A voice that never spoke, but moved things. Some in the Jedi Council proposed a theory that Darth Gravus had died years ago, and that the Sith were using his name to cover an internal collapse. That he had become a story, a tool to enforce silence and discipline where none existed. But others were not so sure, because sometimes Jedi agents disappeared without cause. Sometimes battle plans leaked without a trace. Sometimes a young Padawan would awaken from a nightmare, convinced someone had watched them from deep inside the Force. Not hatred, not violence, observation. And in those moments, even the Jedi whispered, because they, too, had come to believe in the ghost. He was no longer a man, no longer a presence that could be killed. He had become a condition. One Sith Lord put it best during a failed uprising. You don't fight Gravus, you fight your own reflection, and when you lose, he's already behind you. The Empire did not chant his name. It avoided it. His myth wasn't enforced. It was sustained by silence. There came a year when no one saw him. No council chambers, no observatory fleets, no intercepted directives or datapad edits. Darth Gravus simply stopped appearing. Not officially, he had never been official, but even his shadow receded. At first, the Empire waited. Weeks passed, then months, but nothing collapsed. That was the strangest part, because Gravus had shaped everything: strategy, structure, silence, and yet his disappearance didn't trigger panic. It triggered adjustment. Plans continued, orders were issued, fleets deployed, but in every room there was a pause, a delay, as if the architects of power were listening for something before they spoke. They weren't waiting for Gravus to return. They were trying to remember how to rule without him. And most of them couldn't. In truth, Gravus had been withdrawing for years. He stopped speaking in meetings, stopped showing up in person. Then even his fleet movement ceased. Some believed he had entered deep meditation, like the ancient Sith Lords of old, entombing himself in suspended animation to await a galaxy worthy of correction. Others claimed he had died long ago, that his final years of presence had been a projection, some force echo left behind by an act of unnatural Sith sorcery, a final extension of will, playing out predetermined outcomes before fading like a ghost trapped in a pre-recorded holocron. But those closest to him knew better, because they felt it. The silence wasn't passive. It wasn't death. It was chosen. A removal, a subtraction. Gravus wasn't lost. He had stepped out of history. He had guided it just long enough. And now he was letting it run without him. It wasn't surrender. It was a test. A former apprentice once found a locked chamber on an abandoned asteroid outpost. Inside, there was no technology, no throne, just a single inscription burned into obsidian. The Force listens better when you stop speaking. No name, no symbol, but they all knew whose hand had written it. Years passed. The Sith Empire fractured. New wars began. Old threats resurfaced. But still, now and then, something strange would happen. A datapad would go missing from a warship. A corrupted plan would collapse mid-sentence. A traitor would change sides without explanation, claiming they had been warned. No one could prove it. But every time it happened, someone somewhere would whisper his name. And they'd say the same thing. He's still here, somewhere, just not in the way we understand. That was Gravus's final lesson, that the greatest power was not in being seen. It was in being felt without presence, feared without action, trusted without proof. Eventually, the Sith archives updated his entry. No date of death, no declared legacy, just a closing line. Presumed vanished. Influence ongoing. He became a question, one that no Sith dared answer. Because in truth, Gravus was never truly alive in the way others were. He had given up his name, his voice, his hunger. He had made himself less, so that the Empire could bend around him more easily. And that absence became his rule. It didn't fade with time. It expanded. He was never crowned, never worshipped, never mourned. But even centuries later, those who studied the darkest eras of Sith power found anomalies, unnamed edits to battle doctrine, silence stitched into war strategy, tactical ghost steps, moves made by no known hand, but perfectly placed. Some called it luck, some called it legacy, but a few believed it was still him, not living, not undead, just present, watching from the void between stars, between choices, between consequences. That was the terror of Darth Gravus. He didn't die. He dissolved. He didn't rise to power. He removed everything in its way. And when the galaxy looked back searching for a record, a face, a final act, it found only shadows. Because Darth Gravus was never meant to rule the galaxy. He was meant to haunt it, forever. There was no monument, no statue, no funeral, no grave, just a vault, hidden in the older strata of Coraban's catacombs, beneath even the burial layers of Tulak Horde and Ajunta Pal. It wasn't listed on any star chart. It had no inscription, no Sith runes. Only a door, black, smooth, seamless, sealed from the inside. They didn't find it by chance. They found it because a section of the tomb network simply stopped responding. Sensors failed. Heat signatures dropped. Droids sent to investigate never returned. When a Sith recovery team finally breached the outer walls, they found nothing behind them. No power systems, no decay. Not even dust, just a single hallway leading to the vault. And at the end of that hallway, silence. It didn't hum. It didn't echo. It absorbed. Even the Force felt different inside. Thin, pressed, as if something was coiled deep within the stone itself, not sleeping but waiting. There were no signs of battle, no blood, no bones, just an absence, like something had been here, and then wasn't. And for a while, they assumed it was abandoned, until someone tried to open it, not with explosives, not with tools, with the Force. The Sith Lord in charge reached out to unseal the door and collapsed. He didn't scream. He didn't convulse. He just froze. His eyes locked onto the stone. His breath stopped, and for 13 minutes he did not move. When he came back, he spoke only one sentence. It was looking back. He couldn't explain what that meant. He resigned from the council 3 days later and vanished into the outer rim. The Sith never touched the vault again. Not out of fear, out of respect, because they understood something rare. This was not a resting place. This was a decision. Gravus had not been buried. He had sealed himself away. Not to die, not to sleep, to end. End contact, end legacy, end interference. It was the final act of subtraction. A Sith who had erased everything else now erased himself. Some say the vault was empty, that it had always been, that Gravus had dissolved into the Force long before, and this was only a symbol, his final lesson, delivered not with words or power, but with silence. But others weren't so sure, because every few decades someone tried to find it again, and every time they failed. The vault's location changed, slightly, subtly. Its coordinates shifted just enough to vanish from old maps, like it didn't want to be found, or worse, like it could move, not through engines or magic, but through absence, as if it could remove itself from history the same way Gravus had removed himself from life. No fanfare, no collapse, just a door that no one wanted to open. Because deep down, the Sith understood. This was no tomb. It was a mirror, and behind it, there might still be something watching. The oldest corridors of Coraban are not quiet. They breathe. Stone shifts without wind, lights flicker without power, and sometimes, when initiates descend too deep, they return with pale skin and shaking hands, unable to speak about what they heard. Because it wasn't a scream, it wasn't a growl, it was a voice, and it asked a question. Only one. Do you know my name? No threat, no echo, no malice, just stillness. Like the voice wasn't meant to scare them, like it was testing them. Some thought it was a hallucination, a pressure trick, maybe a sound carried from other chambers. But those who heard it always said the same thing. It didn't come from outside. They didn't mean acoustics. They meant it came from within. It didn't touch their ears. It touched their memory, as if someone had placed the words in their mind like a scar already healed. The Sith began to log these events. Each one matched. The location was always the same near the unmarked vault. The voice was always male, always cold, and always calm, not dead, not mechanical, present. And the initiates who heard it changed. They didn't become violent. They didn't run. They just slowed, spoke less, slept less. Some withdrew from training. Others began meditating in total darkness without instruction. One began carving symbols into the walls. Not Sith runes, not language, just shapes, patterns that mirrored orbital paths, war formations, tactical loops. One of the overseers recognized them. They were the same patterns Darth Gravus had used during the silent campaigns when he commanded entire invasions with nothing but gestures and timing. That's when they realized this wasn't just memory, it was influence. Gravus hadn't taught, hadn't recruited, but he was still passing something on. Not through speech, through silence. Like the tomb had become a conduit, not of power, but of design. A way to keep shaping Sith thought without stepping into the light. The overseers sealed off the area, declared it too unstable for training. But the voice didn't stop. It spread. New initiates, ones who had never been near the vault, started hearing it in dreams. Not nightmares, not visions. Just the question. Always the question. Do you know my name? And they always woke in silence. Not because they didn't know the answer, but because they did. They had never studied him, never seen a statue, never read a file. But somehow, in the moment between sleep and waking, they remembered, and in that memory, they felt watched. Not hunted, not judged, just seen. As if Darth Gravus had never truly needed to live forever. He just needed to leave something behind. Not a legacy, a presence. Not a scream, a whisper. They stopped saying his name. Not by law, not by decree. It just happened. As if the syllables had become heavy in the mouth. As if even remembering required permission. The name Gravus still existed in old data files, in preserved council records, in whispers passed between archivists. But no one spoke it aloud. Not even the Dark Lords, especially not them, because something strange had begun. Every time his name was spoken within the temple walls, the lights dimmed. Slightly. Every time it appeared on a data terminal, the screen flickered. Slightly. No failure reports, no system flaws. Just an anomaly. A presence. The scholars of Zias tried to study it. One of them traced every known record of Darth Gravus, cross-referencing battlefield reports, council transcripts, assassination attempts, even conflicting eyewitness accounts. She disappeared 3 days later. Her datapad was found beside the archive gate, still powered, still warm, and on the screen, a single sentence. He is not remembered. He is present. No one opened the file again. It wasn't just fear, it was instinct. Like touching fire, not because you're curious, but because you know it burns. And what the Sith feared now wasn't his power. It was his pattern. Gravus had never claimed titles, never built temples, never left behind holocrons. But somehow, his voice still moved. Not through speech, through influence. Not through teaching, through infection. It became clear he had achieved something no other Sith had. Not immortality, irremovability. He didn't survive through bloodlines or dark rituals. He survived through absence. The Jedi archives still listed him as presumed dead. Some Jedi masters even questioned if he ever truly existed. There were no confirmed holograms, no direct duels. Just effects. An empire ruled from silence. A vault sealed from within. A name nobody dared say twice. Because remembering Gravus didn't feel like history. It felt like permission. Like calling something back. And every Sith, no matter how bold or cruel, knew the rule of the tomb. Some shadows don't wait to be summoned. They wait to be recognized. And if you look too long, they might see you back. So, they stopped recording his name. Stopped citing his wars, stopped tracing his legacy. But the fear remained. It echoed in strategy briefings where young lords mimicked Gravus's methods without knowing the source. It echoed in council chambers, where silence now carried the same weight as command. And most of all, it echoed in dreams. Every Sith had them now and then. A long hallway, a sealed vault, a voice that didn't rise, didn't threaten, didn't scream. Just one sentence. Do you know my name? And no matter how strong they were, no matter how much power they held, none of them answered, because deep down, they knew the truth. It wasn't a question. It was a reminder. The years passed. Empires rose, fell, and rebranded themselves. New Dark Lords took the throne. Others were cast down. But across the centuries, one constant remained. The vault was never opened. No Sith dared, and no Jedi tried. It was left untouched, not hidden, not erased, just unclaimed. Like it was waiting. And as the galaxy forgot the face of Darth Gravus, something strange began to happen among the youngest initiates. They started dreaming of him, but not the way the legends described. Not as a warlord, not as a tactician, not even as a Sith. They saw a man, tall, yes, cloaked, yes, but always still. He never spoke, never moved, just stood at the edge of their dreams like a statue that had chosen to watch. And when they woke, they remembered less. Not the dreams themselves. They couldn't remember the questions they had once asked about the Force, couldn't recall the ambition that once drove them. They simply began to wait, as if something inside them knew that answers weren't meant to be found, only given. And somewhere, far beneath the stone veins of Coraban, the vault remained. Not sealed, quiet, because Gravus had never wanted worship. He had never built a cult, never declared a doctrine. He had no apprentices, no heirs, only silence. And in that silence, his story continued. Whispers in the archives, patterns in war simulations, glitches in droid protocols that followed outdated strategies, strategies that hadn't been used in centuries, but still worked. They called it ghost code. But those who looked closer found something else. A question, embedded in data strings, carved behind forgotten panels, etched into lightsaber components with no maker. The same words over and over. Do you know my name? It became a superstition, then a joke, then a test. Young Sith who thought themselves brave would venture into the lower halls and say his name aloud. Most came back. One didn't. His armor was found outside the vault folded neatly. But there was no trace of a body. No blood, no scorch marks, just silence, and a single boot print facing the door, as if he had walked in willingly. After that, no one spoke the name again, not out of fear, but out of understanding. Because what Gravus had become was no longer human, no longer Sith, no longer legend. He had become memory itself, a presence without source, a shadow without light, a question without answer, not alive, not dead, just watching. And sometimes, when the corridors grow still and the tomb walls seem to breathe, a voice returns, low, emotionless, endless, asking one thing. Do you know my name? And the galaxy remains silent, because deep down they all know. He never wanted to be remembered. He wanted to be unavoidable.